World War I was one of the bloodiest wars in European history, with the total of military and civilian casualties tallying up to around 40 million. In this video, we will be exploring some of the strangest, most surprising battle tactics, quirky adventures, political plots, experimental weapons, non-human soldiers, some strange and questionable theories, and much more. As always, guys, grab a drink. My choice today is Assam tea, and join me as we explore the World War I iceberg. And I probably should have trimmed my beard to be only the mustache, you know, in honor of all of the men with mustaches in World War I. It was massively trendy back then. But for the first entry in Tier 1, we have the Zimmermann telegram. And this was a telegram which is basically a letter that was intercepted by British forces in 1917. And this letter has a wild story. And it was sent from Germany to Mexico, where the German Foreign Minister, Arthur Zimmermann, sent out this coded letter, and that'll be important a little bit later on, but he sent it out to the German ambassador in Mexico, a man named Heinrich von Eckhardt. And Mexico, during this time in World War I, was a neutral country, so they weren't on either side of the war, but this letter, this encoded letter by Zimmermann, set to completely change that. And this telegram read, well, this. And as I said, it was encoded, meaning that at the time it was intercepted by the British intelligence, they weren't able to decipher it or read it. And so they had no idea what this message said until the capture of a man named Wilhelm Wasmus.
Wilhelm Wasmus.
And now, Wilhelm was a very interesting character. And he was basically a spy from Germany that wasn't tasked with like normal spy stuff, you know, being undercover in enemy countries, in getting secret details, intelligence gathering sort of thing. And he was tasked with going to Arabia/Persia, or modern day Iran, and learning all that he could about the Persian people, about their leaders and tribes and traditions and histories. And his goal, you know, his mission in all of this was to go there and to basically spread hatred for the British and more or less start a rebellion. And since the British were big in the area at the time, obviously a Persian rebellion would waste British resources, it would cause a massive distraction, and for a one-man team, it would be pretty cost-effective. And there was also the hope by Germany that this would get the Persians to, you know, rally together to actually start a formal rebellion against the British, and then hopefully for Persia itself to join in the war on the side of Germany. So that was like the top goal of this entire spy mission. And the Middle East, as everyone knows, is very important for oil, for certain supplies and minerals. And so if they were to achieve this and they were able to redirect all of the oil and resources over to Germany instead of Britain, this very well could have been pivotal in changing the entire war. And so, as I said, there was very little cost for doing something like this. You know, it was just one man on a sneaky little covert mission, maybe paying off a few of these Persian leaders. And if it did succeed, the payoff would have been absolutely massive. And Wilhelm honestly did half decently. He spread his influence around, he handed out pamphlets and leaflets, he spoke to a bunch of tribal leaders, kind of rallying them up, saying, you know, we gotta fight against the British. You guys have got to take your own lands back. And so after a while, the British eventually found out about what Wilhelm was trying to do. And so they basically put a bounty on Wilhelm's head. And so he was kind of, you know, dashing around the country, spreading some propaganda here, starting up a little riot, and then he would disappear, and then he would speak to a tribal leader over here, try and get them to rebel, and then disappear again. And he was very slippery as an individual. But eventually, he was invited to dinner in order to discuss a revolt against the British by a friendly tribal leader. Except he wasn't so friendly. He was completely bamboozled, and this tribal leader basically captured him and held him there for the British because he wanted to get the reward that the British had set. But by the time the British had arrived, Wilhelm had escaped. But in his rush to escape, he had left behind all of his luggage. So the British didn't really think too much about this. They took all of his luggage, they sent it back to London, and that was more or less that. It was stored in safekeeping over in London, and even though Wilhelm did escape, he still decided to stay in Persia and try and achieve his goals of some sort of, revolution. And so it's this whole kind of cat and mouse game. He keeps on spreading dissent. The British keep on trying to capture him, but with no real luck. But they notice that he keeps mentioning about his bloody luggage. He'll say like, it's just unbelievable I left my luggage there. Where is my luggage? Who has my luggage? Such a stupid decision to leave my luggage behind. And he even went so far as to get the governor of Shiraz in Persia to formally demand from the British that Wilhelm's luggage be returned to him. And so after all of this, Britain is, starting to kind of question themselves. Like, why the hell does he keep going on about his bloody luggage? What is so important in a suitcase with some books and some clothes, etc.? And so just to double check everything, just to cross their I's and dot their T's, they contacted London and asked them to search his luggage. And inside of his luggage, they found an official secret German codebook, which explains why he was kicking up such a fuss. Any secret encoded messages he may have received, he obviously couldn't decode them. And he was worried about the Allies now having access to this codebook, which they obviously did. And with this German codebook, they were able to decipher many encoded messages, mostly telegrams, and amongst them was the Zimmermann telegram, which they were now able to finally decipher, and it read, "On February 1st, we intend to begin submarine warfare without restriction. In spite of this, it is our intention to endeavor to keep the United States neutral. If this attempt is not successful, we propose an alliance on the following basis with Mexico: that we shall make war together and together make peace. We shall give general financial support, and it is understood that Mexico is to reconquer her lost territory of New Mexico, Texas, and Arizona. The details are left to you for settlement. You are instructed to inform the President of Mexico of the above in the greatest confidence as soon as it is certain that there will be an outbreak of war with the United States, and suggest that the President of Mexico shall, on his own initiative, communicate with Japan, suggesting the latter's adherence at once to this plan, and at the same time offer to mediate between Germany and Japan. Please call to the attention of the President of Mexico that the employment of ruthless submarine warfare now promises to compel England to make peace in a few months. Acknowledge receipt, Zimmermann." But it basically says we want to keep the USA out of war, and if you, Mexico, attack America from the south, you can capture a bunch of your lost territory, and then we will win the war in Europe, we'll take a bunch of land there, and so everybody wins. Except, as we covered, the telegram was intercepted. It never actually reached Mexico. And honestly, I don't know if Mexico would have even agreed to, just up and invade the bloody USA, because while it wasn't the military powerhouse that it is today, it was still a very large nation that was likely pretty capable of defending itself. And so I don't know if that would have been the best idea for Mexico, but maybe with the support of Germany, something maybe could have happened. I think Germany was mostly using it as a distraction tactic. Maybe they knew Mexico would never win that war, but they just wanted to keep the US occupied and out of Europe. And when the United States found out about this, they saw this as kind of as close to a declaration of war on the United States by Germany as you could possibly get, without actually declaring war. But this message, this telegram was, I think, quite pivotal in eventually pushing the US over into war. And there were obviously a few other reasons, but this was definitely up there. And so just a few months later, the US did declare war on Germany, and we all know how that turned out for the Germans. The Christmas Truce was exactly what it sounds like, and it occurred in 1914 on the 24th of December, which was really just a few months after the war had begun. And there was basically this unofficial truce set up among combatants, so Germans, French, British, as well as a few other allies, on either side of the trenches, where they basically called a temporary truce. So that was no shells fired, no bullets fired, no killing, no fighting, and they just came out of the trenches on either side. They met up in the middle of no man's land, and they basically just chilled for an entire day. You know, it was an incredibly wholesome thing to see, and we have both photographic evidence of this, as well as drawings and sketches, as well as written accounts by many, many men. And it seems like they just took one day out around Christmas to just connect as human beings instead of opposing soldiers on, you know, opposite sides of a war. They quite famously played football. They also exchanged gifts, so like chocolate, tobacco, sausages from the Germans. They sung songs, Christmas carols even, and obviously as well played a few games of football. And considering most of these soldiers on the front line in World War I were, you know, young men, with a lot of them even being underaged men, you know, who had basically faked their age in order to get into the war. Like, that's how badly they wanted to fight for their country. So most of these soldiers were, you know, 17 or 18. A few were in their early 20s, a few were 14, 15, 16. And so just for one day, they were basically just friends. They were kids playing football after school against like a rival school or something. They were humans. There was no deaths, no fighting, just peace, as I said, for a day. And this started kind of around the night of the 24th. The truce lasted the entirety of the 25th. And then as the 26th approached, everyone kind of slowly made their way back to their opposing sides. They went back into the trenches, and as soon as midnight struck, each side let out flares, signaling that the truce was over and it was back to fighting and killing and bombing and shooting just the very next day. So for me, this is a very wholesome part of history that, you know, something as insane and brutal as the First World War could have been actually just put on pause in order to celebrate Christmas among all the troops. And in subsequent years, this truce wasn't started at all. You know, Christmas in every other year after this, they didn't do a truce. They didn't like go out and play football, as I think sadly a lot of the commanding officers were against this. So they didn't really like the idea of a truce or of a little break from the war. And so for every year after this, they just weren't having it. That's nice. But if you are enjoying the video, please do leave a like and subscribe to help me with my goal of 100,000 subscribers. Also, hype the video, as apparently that's a thing now. And of course, do enjoy the rest of the video. Rasputin's death. So for those who haven't heard the song, Rasputin was basically a religious man, a mystic, whose philosophy was that in order to receive God's grace, you know, God's blessings, man needed to sin and then needed to repent for these sins. And this process would bring you closer to God. Hence his reputation of being kind of a sex hound. You know, he was very sinful in that regard, which I guess he repented for, and then he felt that that brought him closer to God. But after wandering around as a holy man for several years, he eventually made his way into St. Petersburg. And then after a while of being there, he becomes acquainted with the royal family, the Romanovs. And then, as he is a mystic, you know, a religious man with apparent magical powers, he is tasked with treating the prince's pain due to a specific health condition that the prince had. And so he was famous in the city. The royal family, especially the mother, said, can we bring him in, see if we can help our son? And apparently his methods did, in some sense, help the prince. And so the royal family kind of kept him around, kept in contact with him, and he was known at the time especially for having somewhat of an undue influence on the Tsars, you know, on the royal family. And also to a lot of the conservative people, he was known as sexing women up, of being just rough around the edges, unconventional, immoral. And so on December 30th of 1916, a bunch of noblemen arranged to have Rasputin killed, and in the end, it took a hell of a lot to take him down. They initially invited him to the Moika Palace under the pretense of introducing this other prince's wife to Rasputin. So women is clearly a, you know, thing that he couldn't resist, apparently. And while he was there, all the people said, you know, Rasputin, come in, make yourself at home, come into this warm palace, feast on these cakes, which are secretly lined with cyanide, which we're not going to tell you about, and also drink this fine wine, also laced with cyanide. And he was like, yeah, thank you. It's very nice. And he just ate all of the cake, he drank all of the wine with enough cyanide in it to kill a normal man, you know, 3 times over. But they were confused when Rasputin didn't really react at all. They were like, what the bloody hell is going on here? Except they said it with a Russian accent. What the bloody hell? What the bloody hell is going on here? What the bloody hell is going on? What the bloody hell is happening? I've got about as good a Russian accent as John Malkovich does. But after consuming all of this poison, he obviously wasn't dead. He wasn't even really showing signs of being poisoned. And so they just ended up shooting him in the chest. And then he fell down and they were like, God, we needed to resort to shooting him, really. And they took Rasputin's hat, they took his coat, and their plan was to have someone else wear the hat and the coat, and then have them leave the palace, so that witnesses would have said, oh yeah, he didn't die inside. No, he left the palace. We saw him leave with his hat and his coat, and so we don't know where he went. But as they were carrying out this plan, Rasputin just rose up, like apparently from the dead after having been shot, and he attacked the prince and then ran out into the courtyard to escape, and then it is there that they shoot him again. They smash him over the head with a piece of wood, and by this point it seems like he is really dead, and so they pick him up and they carry him to the Petrovsky Bridge, and they dump him underneath the bridge in the freezing water. And he was found just a few days later underneath the ice, showing signs of having been shot, of having been hit over the head, but not of being poisoned or of drowning, which says to me that he was already dead when they dumped him in the water. And so he wasn't breathing, he wouldn't have shown signs of drowning if there's no water in his lungs, sort of thing. But this led to the whole rumor, you know, how did he survive all this poisoning? And the main consensus was that he had basically been micro-dosing various poisons over the years. And so the idea with that, and I should put a disclaimer here, I am not a medical doctor, obviously don't consume poisons, even in the micro form. But say 1 gram of cyanide would kill a man, Rasputin would take 1/100th of a gram. He would take this each day, and then maybe he would go up to 2/100th of a gram, and he would just slowly build this immunity in his body. Much like how if someone has caffeine every day, they often build up an immunity and they need more and more caffeine in order for it to have the same effect. So it is thought that he did that with various poisons to avoid being poisoned himself, which is honestly a little bit clever, but it does require you to take all of these horrible poisons constantly, which very likely have long-term effects to them. But the short-term effect is you don't die from cyanided cake or wine. And on this occasion, it definitely seems like it would have worked if it weren't for them obviously shooting him twice and bonking him over the head. Archduke Franz Ferdinand. Was this man the heir to the Austro-Hungarian Empire, which was this huge area here, which today is split into many different countries? But at the time, the big whole country slash area / empire, this guy was set to inherit all of it and to start ruling it, after the current ruler either left the throne or ended up dying. But when he and his wife were on a state visit down to Sarajevo in Bosnia, or I guess it was technically called Bosnia and Herzegovina, like this area here, but this area was also close to this country, Serbia. And Serbia wasn't too happy about the Austro-Hungarian Empire for, as you can imagine, many reasons. Austria-Hungary had been slowly, in some cases, and quickly in other cases, kind of pushing the boundaries of its empire, trying to take more and more land. The Serbians wanted to hold them back. They weren't happy at all with how Austria-Hungary was growing. And so, as Ferdinand was planning his visit down to Sarajevo, this group of ethnic nationalist Serbians saw this as an opportunity to get a little payback and to basically kill the heir to the Austro-Hungarian Empire. And after one failed attempt, which was bombing his car as he drove past, they eventually did manage to shoot him and his wife, killing them both, and Austria-Hungary then basically declared war on Serbia. If you want to go into the finer details, they didn't technically declare war on them. They just sent them a list of demands, which some people say was reasonable. Other people say was so unreasonable that it was basically forcing Serbia to say no, to give Austria-Hungary the excuse to start this war. But it was basically like, let us into your country, let us have access to all of these things. We're going to put police and investigators inside your country and figure out who did this, who killed Franz Ferdinand, where their connections were, who they were funded by, and it kind of, I think, would have been like a soft takeover of Serbia. And so Serbia was basically like, nope, you're not coming in, we're not giving you any information, you're not having police here, we're not having none of it. And so realistically, what do you do as Austria-Hungary? You've just come down to this area, these Serbians have killed your heir to the throne, kind of like killing your president or prime minister or leader, even though he wasn't the leader yet, but it was the same sort of principle. And so do you just say, oh, okay, you can just do what you want? Do you not defend your country? Do you ignore this death and this planned assassination? Like, it was kind of tricky from both sides. But with Austria-Hungary declaring war on Serbia, this is what basically started World War I. Because you had Germany backing up Austria-Hungary, you had the Russians backing up the Serbians, and then because Russia and France had an alliance, Germany knew that if they started a war with Russia, which seemed inevitable at this point, that they would also indirectly be starting a war with France. And so they had this whole plan that Russia would take longer to mobilize their troops. They were a bigger country, they would take a while to get to Germany, hopefully, and France was right there. So the plan was to do like a blitzkrieg, a fast offensive into France to overwhelm the French defense, to take over France, and then to redirect all of the troops over to the east in order to fight Russia. And this would have gone perfectly well, except for the fact that France put up a really decent defense. Germany was kind of rushed for time, and so they ended up invading neutral Belgium in order to try and get a flank on the French. And this annoyed the British because you're not allowed to invade neutral countries, and so the British got involved. And yeah, that is how you get 4, 5, 6 countries all fighting a war, all within just a few months of this event. The Battle of the Somme. So before we explore this very important, very pivotal battle, we really quickly, really briefly, need to do a little background for it. And so the war started, World War I started in 1914, and honestly, the amount of takes I have done for this, where I have said 2014, is not even funny, and I'm sure I'll make that mistake again sometime in this video. But as we just mentioned, the plan for Germany at this point was to overwhelm France and then to redirect all of its troops over to the east to fight Russia. But after France put up a decent defense, they were slowing down the Germans. The Germans thought, how can we get around the French defense lines? And some clever German, I don't know who it was, but they came up with the idea of going north and then going around behind France. Or not behind France, it would still be France, but they're going behind the French defense and maybe attacking them from the sides, from behind. So it sounds like a fantastic plan, except for the fact that north wasn't Germany, it wasn't even France, but it was a little neutral country called Belgium. And if the Germans wanted to go through Belgium, they either had to invade Belgium, which it was always a bit risky invading neutral countries because it was seen as a massive act of aggression, or they needed to get permission. So at first they did try the permission route. They were very nice, they were very cordial. They went in and said, look, Belgium, we want to come through your country. We will use your trains and accommodation, but we will pay for everything. You know, we will buy our own tickets for these trains. We will pay you for the inconvenience. We will bring our own food. Or if we do take any food, we will pay you for it. We will pay for all of our accommodations for our troops. And if anything does get messed up or destroyed or broken or whatever, we will pay for that as well. So they were really trying to be very nice about it. Like, please, Belgium, can we just come round and invade France from the north? Like, pretty please? Hello, Belgium? And Belgium was like, absolutely not. And so the Germans just invaded them. And for a force and army the size of this small, peaceful little Belgium, they actually put up one hell of a fight. You know, they did lose a lot of the battles, they did lose ground to the Germans, but they massively slowed down the Germans, with the Germans eventually just getting so frustrated at the time that the Belgians were costing them, that they decided to just start burning down villages, destroying towns, shooting civilians. And before this invasion of Belgium, it could be argued from like an outsider's perspective that the Germans weren't really the bad guys. You know, Serbia kind of started it with assassinating Franz Ferdinand. Germany was just backing up the defender, sort of, in that sense. And then they were tied into this war through Russia and then through its ally France. So it could have been seen as like a tit-for-tat sort of fair war. But with the invasion of Belgium, most other countries were like, bro, you can't just do that. You can't just invade a neutral country. And you especially can't start burning down its villages, shooting its civilians. And so this is more or less what brought Britain into the war. Britain wasn't really obliged to join the war by, you know, connections with any other country, but they had many years ago swore to protect Belgium's independence, their choice as a sovereign nation. And so with the German invasion of them, Britain then declared war on Germany. So fast forward to 1916, and you have a vast trench network with the Germans on one side and the British and French on another side. And on the British and French side, you also had a bunch of the allies. So you had Australian troops, you had Indians, you had West Indians, New Zealanders, but they were all fighting to the west of this line, with the Germans fighting to the east of it, and it stretched all the way from Belgium down to Switzerland, with honestly neither side making much headway. And for the most part, Germany is kind of trying to defend their gains. You know, Germany is mostly trying to defend, the Allies are mostly trying to attack, trying to push ground, and especially in World War I, advancing typically lost you more soldiers than defending. Because if you can imagine, if you're defending, you don't really need to move anywhere. You have the safety of the trenches. You can hide down there. You can shoot over the top of it. You can fire artillery from the back over into no man's land or into the opposing trenches. And you don't really need to move or expose yourself too much. But if you're attacking, if you want to capture land, if you want to push positions, you typically just needed to kind of, as gruesome as it sounds, throw human bodies at it. You typically had to just overwhelm the opposing position by sending troops over the top of the trenches, into no man's land, often into just oncoming machine gun fire. And you had to just keep doing this until the enemy got tired, or they ran out of bullets, or there was a gap in their defense or something. And this, for a large part, explains why there was such high casualties in World War I. And just a quick aside, one of the reasons for this apparently just insane tactic was that the last major wars for a lot of these countries in Europe were a good few years ago. And since those wars, technology, especially with like guns and war weapons and all of that, had advanced quite massively. So you have the tactics kind of still on this level, and the weapons have gone from this level to this level to this level. And so when they come into World War I, a lot of the armies still had colorful uniforms. They didn't even have metal helmets, they just wore cloth hats. Their tactics and strategy was like all over the place. And a normal tactic that might have worked in previous wars, you know, against like rifle fire or musket fire, where you had to reload the musket and then you got one shot, then you had to reload it again. But with those sorts of weapons, something like running over the top might have worked. You know, if you send 1,000 troops over the top, you can, I think, quite easily overwhelm a certain amount of enemies if they're just using muskets or rifles, as they might need to fire and then reload the gun, fire, maybe they miss some of the shots, and so you might lose, I don't know, 200 soldiers, with the other 800 actually making it through, taking over the trenches. But with these new weapons, with new artillery, with heavy shrapnel, with machine guns, which was a big one, this tactic just absolutely didn't work. You would send 1,000 troops over the top, and within 5 minutes, within 2 minutes, you would have 1,000 troops shot. You know, there was hardly any reloading for these machine guns. The rate of fire was just insane compared to rifles, and they could just mow down entire fields of people with almost no risk. And that's not even to say anything about the general vibe and feel of World War I. As I said, before this you had typically bright uniforms, and this was normally so that opposing sides could tell each other apart on the battlefield. And it would normally go like, you know, you go with your army, you march around, you find a field to have a battle on, and then you would just fight that battle, and whoever won ended up winning the war. And so stuff like bright uniforms made sense, whereas in World War I, a lot of the uniforms for these countries had to be basically shifted to various shades of green or black or grey, just to blend in with everything. And it was also the first real use of trenches in a war, or at least in a war this size. And so living in trenches for years at a time, in the cold, in the wet, in the mud, with rats running around and disease and all that, it wasn't anything like what people imagined war to be before this. You know, where you'd go to fight for your country and you'd scream "Vive la France" or "Vive la France," and then run out and maybe win, maybe die a glorious death. No, this was like stretched out, elongated, suffering, torture, horrible death numbers. It was just absolutely awful. But to simplify this battle, the Germans had planned to attack at Verdun, and so the Allies had planned to counterattack at somewhere called Somme, and to basically divert the attention of these Germans, forcing them to send more soldiers down to Somme, and, you know, more supplies, more resources, in order to lessen the impact of their Verdun attack. So, pretty straightforward. But throughout this battle of 4.5 months, there were over 1 million casualties, with almost 20,000 British soldiers dying in just the first day, like just one day, making it by far, even to this point, the deadliest single day in British Army history. And at least part of this reason for the massive death toll was the fact that the British thought that they had a really good plan. They would bombard the German side for like a week with artillery, with shrapnel, which would kill a bunch of Germans. It would also demoralize them, demotivate them, and it would also flatten out no man's land, you know, destroying the barbed wire they had set up, making kind of a flat, clear path. And then they would just send over their troops over the trenches into no man's land, walk straight across, and then take over the German position just willy-nilly. Except that isn't really what happened. A lot of the British artillery shells were faulty. They either missed their targets or they landed and didn't go off. And the Germans were more well prepared than the British thought. And they had dug further bunkers, they had dug deeper bunkers. And so all of these strikes, the ones that landed on the German side, they weren't as impactful as the British thought. They weren't as loud or as damaging or as terrifying. And the strikes also failed to flatten out no man's land. And so when they sent all of their troops over the top, often instructing soldiers just to walk across no man's land. You know, they were so convinced that it was so safe, there's no way the Germans will fire back at us. They said, just walk across the top, don't even bother running, and save all your energy for when you're down on the other side fighting the Germans. And so they did just that. The British had to be kind of funneled into certain routes because of all the barbed wire still on the no man's land. And so when the British soldiers did appear to the Germans, funneled into nice, neat little areas, all the British soldiers just walking, the Germans mounted their machine guns and, for lack of a better term, just ended up mowing them down, which, as I said, led to 20,000 British soldiers dead in just a single day. And funnily enough, this battle saw the first ever use of a tank, which was a British invention, and it looked like a machine from the future, but we will cover that in a full entry a little further down. And after more than 4.5 months of fighting, the Allies only really managed to push like 6 miles into the German lines. So it was a victory for sure. Technically it was a victory, but really, at what cost? Bonus entry, the first British tank. So I promised we would cover this in an entry further down, but I just couldn't wait to talk about it, so we will be mentioning it now. But yes, this was a tank that the British invented, and which obviously, tanks were absolutely huge in World War II, but they were almost non-existent in World War I. And they were first used in the Battle of the Somme by the British against the Germans, and these were designated the name of Mark I. And they do look pretty cool. They must have been absolutely terrifying for the German infantry. You're used to seeing soldiers and maybe dogs and horses sort of thing, and then you pop your head up and you see this futuristic death machine made of metal rolling towards you. And yeah, pretty terrifying. But in all honesty, they were rather ineffective. They were clunky, slow, they broke down a lot, and so they didn't see too much use, especially in this battle, but they were used, as I said, for the first time in this battle in World War I. The Armenian Genocide. So this entry brings us to the Eastern Front, when in October of 1914, the Ottoman Empire officially enters the war on the side of the Central Powers, otherwise known as the bad guys. After some Ottoman ships launch attacks on Russian ports in the Black Sea, this pushes Russia to then formally declare war on the Ottomans. So there are a few fights. The Russians cross over this line into Ottoman territory, and they're eventually forced back into Sarikamis. And then the Ottomans try to basically cut off the Russians by going up and around and flanking the Russians. But this ends up being a massive blunder, resulting in around 75,000 Ottoman soldiers dying, most of them from lack of supplies, from freezing temperatures, and from starvation. And considering the Ottoman Third Army only had around 100 to 110,000 soldiers to begin with, this was basically 2/3 of that army just gone. The Russians only lost around kind of less than 10,000 soldiers. But after this great defeat, the Ottomans started to blame ethnic Armenians who were living within the Ottoman Empire. They started to blame them for their defeat, saying that they sabotaged this battle and they were to blame for it. And the Ottomans basically just wanted these Armenians out of the empire. They saw them as quite a big internal enemy, and obviously with these Armenians being Christians and the Ottomans being Muslim, this was also a further dividing line between the two groups. So almost immediately the Ottomans took out all of the Armenians out of the army, and they removed them from leadership positions, from political positions, so in their eyes they could no longer sabotage these Ottoman war efforts. Around 250 Armenian intellectual leaders, politicians, were then arrested and either sent to prison camps or deported or executed. And soon enough, deportations of all Armenians from the entire country started, with anyone who didn't go along with this or anyone who fought back or protested just being immediately arrested and or executed. They then passed laws authorizing confiscation of, all of the Armenian people's property, and this included, personal property, this included lands, and this continued until basically the end of the war in 1918, when by this point the norm in in the country and among the people in general was mass deportations to labor camps and slave camps in the Syrian desert, mass executions, mass death walks, which is where they would basically just force people to march, these absurd distances, often with very limited food or water. And if they arrived at this place, if they survived the march, then they were just put in one of these prison or slave camps. And if they died along the way, which many of them did, they were just pushed off the side of the road, maybe buried if they were lucky. But it was a really, really brutal sort of set of events. There was also mass forced Islamization of a lot of the civilians, and everything the Armenians owned was obviously then confiscated by the Ottomans. And by the end of the war, this resulted in roughly 1 million Armenian Christians having been killed, and this would, at least in part, lead to basically the collapse of the Ottoman Empire during the Turkish War of Independence just a few years later. The Schlieffen Plan, which, as well as sounding hilarious, the Schlieffen Plan, Schleifen, tomato, potato, was a plan created by Alfred von Schlieffen, who was the German Chief of General Staff in around 1905. And this was just a general strategy of a crazy idea, what if, and I'm not saying this would ever happen, what if for some reason some heir was assassinated, and then Serbia attacks, and then we need to back up our boys, the Austria-Hungary Empire, and then Russia attacks, and then France attacks. And yeah, it's just a hypothetical, which ended up a few years later being reality. But this plan didn't obviously plan for all of that. It wasn't really in the details of how the war would start or anything like that. But this plan was for, if war ever did start throughout Europe, that Germany would first invade France and hope to overwhelm France and then send all of its troops probably over to Russia, because it anticipated that Russia and France were in alliance, and so it would have to fight a two-front war. And so the plan was, and always was, to first defeat France and then move over to the Eastern Front. And in this plan, it was kind of theorized that maybe they could go up into the Netherlands and then perhaps bop over the water into France, or just go straight across Belgium into France. And this invasion of the Netherlands didn't actually happen in World War I, but the initial aggression onto France and the invasion of Belgium did end up happening. And so for this plan to work, for the Germans not to be forced into a two-front war, they would have to quickly defeat France and then swap all of the troops over, which explains why they were in such a hurry to do so, which explains why they were so impatient. And so since the French put up a really good defense, that kind of forced their hand. It forced them to make the mistake of going into Belgium. And then because the Belgians put up a good defense, this meant that they couldn't really fully go into Belgium. Or, I mean, they did go into Belgium, but it wasn't like a complete takeover of the entire country. They were able to hold out somewhat until the British arrived. And then with the British came the British Indians, came the British Australians and New Zealanders. And so invading Belgium, I think, was one of the greatest mistakes for Germany in the First World War. But they also didn't really have a choice, because if they didn't quickly invade and take over France, they would almost certainly lose a two-front war between France and Russia. The Russian Revolution. So before World War I, Russia was kind of buddy-buddy with Britain. They had signed a peace deal in 1907, basically saying, all right, let's just be chill with each other. I won't attack you. You don't attack me. Maybe we have a soft alliance. But this alliance, importantly, didn't necessitate that if Russia started a war with someone, that Britain was automatically obliged to join their side and to join the war. And so in 1914, when these Serbian nationalists killed Franz Ferdinand, Austria-Hungary declares war on Serbia. Serbia is like Russia's best friend. So then Russia jumps in. Later, Britain jumps in, joining the war. And so this was originally the basis for the Triple Entente, or the Triple Alliance, or the Allies, being of course Britain, France and Russia. And even though the Russians fought very valiantly, very bravely over in the Eastern Front, almost 2 million Russians were dead in the First World War, which by some estimations is more than any other single country. You know, the Germans were also quite up there with the total deaths, but they also lost around an estimated 400,000 civilians, with Germany losing an estimated less than 1,000, with the Russians losing more people than the French and British and all of the British colonies, the West Indians, the British Indians, Australians, New Zealanders. Russia lost more than all of them combined. And so eventually during the war, the Russian civilians, the Russian population start to get kind of annoyed at this. Most of the people are poor, most of the people are starving. Almost everyone knows some father or son or brother or cousin or whatever who has gone out to the war and just died for seemingly no reason. And the soldiers are somewhat underfunded. They don't have enough guns, they don't have enough ammo, they're not properly geared, and it just seemed like the Russian leadership were just throwing bodies at the Germans. They didn't care about their own people. And you know, it got to the point where the Russian soldiers would just be charging onto German gunfire, you know, charging at machine guns just with whatever was around. Whether this was an actual gun, which that would be rare to have, but whether it was, you know, bayonets from the gun, or knives, or sticks lying around, or even their bare fists. And this resulted, as you can imagine, in just absolute bloodbaths. And at the same time, during all of this, the royal family, which were at the time the Romanovs, led by the Tsar, they were just living it up. While their people were starving and impoverished and running off to war to defend their country and dying and suffering, the Romanovs were incredibly rich. They were living in palaces, drinking fine wine with fine foods, sleeping on silk pillows, and it was honestly just absolutely absurd. So inevitably, there was to be a revolt, which ended up being named the February Revolt, and this eventually basically took the Romanovs out of power. Then a new government was installed. The Romanovs by this point were under house arrest, and this new government did kind of try to distribute a little bit of the wealth. You know, I think they were slightly better than the Tsars, but honestly, they didn't really fix many of the problems. They didn't really go far enough. And importantly, they also didn't put an end to the war. And so this man named Lenin, who was firstly responsible for the initial revolt, he was still fighting with the Bolsheviks to overthrow Russia. And since the new government was still in the war, they hadn't really fixed anything. Lenin came along, who was very charismatic. He was a good speaker. He promised everyone peace and bread. Only if they supported him, they helped him get into power. And this resulted in the October Revolution, which overthrew that prior government. And it installed this new Bolshevik communist government. And soon after that, a deal was made between Russia and Germany. And Russia basically said to Germany, look, we're not going to fight you anymore. Let's just agree to kind of disagree on this whole thing. Let's make peace, and you can have some of our lands, you know, we'll accept them losses, but basically no more war. And that was that. Lenin ruled this communist state, later becoming the USSR, for around 7 years before he died. Then Stalin took over, and between them, they were responsible for an estimated 40 million deaths of Russians, of civilians, due to famines, disease, political executions, and forced labor, and also with a spattering of deportations in there. So yeah, the Tsars were not that great. The new government that came and took over wasn't that great either. The Bolsheviks, the communists, they promised a lot, and in the initial stages it seemed like it was good for the people. They overthrew the leaders, they took a bunch of their wealth in terms of like treasures and lands, they sold it off to other countries in order to help fund the government, fund Russia. But eventually, with this sort of communist dictatorship, it just wound up being a police state, with any dissent being punishable by death. Tier 2, destroy this mad brute. And this was an interesting piece of war propaganda that was put out by the US shortly after joining the war in Germany. And as you can see, it is represented by this huge violent ape wearing a German helmet and carrying a bloody club with the word culture on it, or, culture in German. And in the background, you can see the destroyed landscape of Europe with this ape, this mad brute, stepping onto the shores of America, holding hostage this innocent-looking woman who is supposed to represent either America or American society or justice or innocence or what have you. And then at the bottom of the poster, this big old enlist, in big text, enlist, just so that the youth who see this poster, they know what to do next in order to solve this mad brute problem. Enlist in the military and join the good fight over in Europe. It is a very interesting piece of war propaganda, which of course it wasn't just the Americans doing this. You had propaganda from Germany, from France, from Britain, and honestly most countries really. This one is perhaps just one of the most unique and notable ones. The 3 Secrets of Fatima was a very strange entry, and it took place in 1917 towards the end of the war, when the Virgin Mary repeatedly appeared 6 times to these 3 girls in Fatima, Portugal. The Mother Mary apparently revealed these visions and told these prophecies to these girls, resulting in 3 secrets or 3 visions and prophecies. The first showed the girls a vision of hellfire with a great sea of fire under the earth with souls and demons and all sorts burning violently. And then she also showed them heaven, and apparently was kind of using this as a warning to people for them to stop sinning, and that was the first secret. The second included a prophecy that World War II would soon end, but unless the people repented, that another much greater, much worse war would commence, that obviously being World War II. And the third prophecy paints the image of a holy man, maybe the Pope in these white clothes, being killed up on a hill by soldiers firing bullets, firing arrows, with the further deaths of other holy men, priests, bishops, clergymen, etc., all culminating in this somewhat horrible scene. And I'm not too sure where to begin with this one. The Mother Mary apparently came to these girls in 1917, but they were only written down, the 3 prophecies, in 1941, 24 years later. And actually, that was only the first and the second secrets, because the third one wouldn't be released until 1944 and wouldn't be released publicly. So it was initially released to the Vatican, to the church, etc., but it wouldn't be made public knowledge until the year 2000. And some people think that the third prophecy might have been a reference to the 1981 assassination of John Paul, Pope John Paul II, or they think it might have been a more vague prophecy referencing the downfall of religion, the overall decline of religion in Europe especially, with all of these bishops and priests and the Pope, etc., being killed symbolically, dying at the hands of soldiers, so perhaps signaling that the 2 world wars would cause a decline in religion. Who knows? And so as the story overall, you've got these 3 prophecies told to children, and then over 20 years later, they're officially told and written down, which were obviously at that point predicting things that had already happened. And so in my eyes, it's just a little bit strange, a little bit iffy. Like, I'm sure they could have said anything at that point. It's one thing predicting World War II years before World War II, but it's another thing to say, yeah, I received a message, I received a prophecy in 1905, and then only come out to the public in like the 1960s and say, yeah, I received a prophecy about World War II. I kind of knew it was going to happen, but I didn't tell anyone for, 50 years. And so prophecies, I think, for me, are kind of hard to measure. They're hard to tell whether they were actually prophecies if they're revealed after the thing has actually happened. But the church and the Pope have apparently confirmed these sightings with the gulls. They've done interviews with them, they've investigated them, and over the years, there have only been 12 confirmed visions, confirmed connections with the Virgin Mary, and this is out of the hundreds of reports that they get, almost every year. So the church is convinced that these were real, as well as the Vatican, as well as the Pope. And so for them, this is some sort of divine revelation. And so those are the three secrets of Fatima. Lawrence of Arabia was this man, Thomas Edward Lawrence, who was born in Wales in 1888 and who had an early interest in Arabia, worked as a translator for a bit and as an archaeologist. And eventually, when World War I started, he was incredibly pivotal for pushing the Arab people into revolting against the Ottoman Empire. So it's kind of funny. You have the German guy who was trying to push the Persians to revolt, against the British. And you also have this British guy over in Arabia trying to get them to revolt against the Ottoman Empire. And these sorts of kind of mini missions between sort of spies, sort of civilians, it's unclear what their exact role or definition was, but these sort of soft wars tended to happen quite a lot, as opposed to, the hard war on the front line with bullets and bombs, etc. So yeah, they did happen quite a lot, but these are just some of the more successful, the more notable, and or the most interesting entries about these specific people. And Thomas Edward Lawrence of Arabia, which is where the term comes from, Lawrence of Arabia. There's a great film made about him as well. But his push with the Arabs did in part help to defeat the Ottoman Empire and helped to win the Allies World War I. And at this point in time, the Ottoman Empire looked like this. Pretty expansive, not as expansive as hundreds of years ago, perhaps, at its peak, but a large empire nonetheless. And Lawrence of Arabia led revolts, uprisings, he bribed various Ottoman officials, and in general pushed a lot of the Arab people, particularly a man named Prince Faisal, into going to war against the Ottomans and to claiming more land for the Arabs. And honestly, the Arabs didn't need too much convincing. The Ottoman Turks had ruled over their people and their lands. They discriminated against the Arabs in favor of the ethnic Turkish, and so sooner or later the Arabs were bound to revolt. But Lawrence and the Brits kind of fanned the flames a little bit and provided the Arabs with weapons and ammunition and resources, and also promised the Arabs an independent Arab state, something roughly like this, which in theory, that's a pretty nice, pretty big state. However, after the Allies won the war, the Arabs didn't get this state at all. The land was split up between the French and the British, partly to pay for, the losses in the war. And most of this area was just then under their control. Technically, they were kind of free, kind of independent states, but they were still under British or French rule, and they were basically colonies. They absolutely weren't free states, and the Arabs never got their singular, united, free Arab state that they were promised. But over the years, they did, slowly revolt against the British and French rule, so each place did kind of win its independence over time, which, as you can see on this modern map, there are quite a few countries, independent countries, in this entire area. PTSD Soldiers. So actually, in and around World War I, PTSD, which stands for Post-Traumatic Stress Disorder, was instead mostly called shell shock, named for the shock that a lot of these soldiers would get from all of the artillery shells being dropped down on them. And the First World War was one of the first wars, really like the first major war, that had this level of shell-shocked soldiers. Because in old wars, you would, shout charge. Unless you're French, then it would be charge. I don't know why, but I just love the French accent. Vive la France! But yeah, they would shout, they would charge in with their bayonets or muskets or rifles or what have you. And yes, some soldiers would die, obviously. Some would be traumatized due to death or injury or stress, but it was never as prolonged and drawn out and just relentless as it was in World War I. Yes, if you went over the front lines, you had a really high chance of dying, but most of those soldiers didn't really develop trauma because you're just in the trenches, you go over the top, you're shot, you die, that's the end of that. But if you didn't go over the top, or you somehow survived going over the top, you would find yourself in the trenches for days or weeks or months at a time, constantly being smashed with these artillery shells, and it was this prolonged stress of just interminable explosions, sounds, being exposed to people dying and bleeding and your friends being injured and even killed, that this prolonged experience led to a massive increase in trauma among all the soldiers. And it was around World War I when doctors started to formally, seriously make the distinction in diagnosis of soldiers between physical injuries, brain damage, hearing damage, limbs blown off, etc., and mental damage. So stuff like trauma, shell shock, depression, the inability to speak any longer, panic attacks, and that sort of thing. It was a truly horrific, brutal, traumatizing experience for most of the soldiers, even more so than World War II, in my opinion. You were either sent over the top to die in just mass groups, thousands and tens of thousands and hundreds of thousands of soldiers dying this way. It must have been extremely terrifying, extremely demoralizing. It's not like this glorious thing where you lay down your life for the country. Like in these charges, the lives of these young men almost meant nothing. Often they didn't gain any ground. They didn't accomplish or achieve anything. They were just blindly sent over the top, wave after wave, straight into oncoming German machine gun fire. And then if you weren't doing that, you were trapped down in these trenches, which were wet, cold. They had rat infestations, with some of the rats, it was said, growing as large as cats, because the rats were extremely well fed. They were eating the corpses, they were eating any leftover food or food that they could find, and so it was absolutely hell living down there. There was bombs and artillery falling. There was gas as well being thrown over into these trenches, and because of the amount of moisture and water in the trenches, there was also diseases and conditions like trench foot, where people's legs would basically just start rotting, and it was absolutely horrific, and it was one of the worst conditions in any war, so you can imagine why this led to so many soldiers having PTSD. The Gallipoli Campaign. So as World War I was in full swing, in 1915 the Russians weren't doing too great, and so they were like, hello? Can anyone give me a hand over here? Maybe Britain, perhaps? Can you stop eating and drinking tea and crumpets and come over and help me out? And so the British were annoyed at this because they love tea and crumpets. They are a national delicacy. But they basically said, fine, we'll take a crumpet break. And so because the Western Front was all trench-based, it was more or less at a stalemate. In order for the British to get over to Russia to help them out, they couldn't go by land. It was very hard to go up to the north of Russia in the really cold waters, and then down into one of the frozen ports, and then down through Russia to help them on the Eastern Front. The British decided to help them in another way, and that was by attacking the Ottoman Empire. And so they started this campaign called the Gallipoli Campaign, and that was a plan to basically come all the way round here with their ships and to power through the Dardanelles, which is basically this area here, this little water path through onto the Black Sea. And then the idea was they would control this peninsula, they would be able to set up some bases here, they would be able to sail into the Black Sea and provide Russia with support from the south, while also at the same time, you know, knocking out the Ottomans via the south or in the south. If the great Russian fleet was able to control the Black Sea, it would just have been insane for the Allies. And so that was the plan anyway, but it basically ended up being a complete and miserable failure. The British took all of their ships through the Dardanelles, which were fortified with mines, with guns stationed all along the edges, and this resulted in initially the destruction of 3 of the British warships. So they were then kind of like, yeah, how about no? They turned around all of their ships, they left this little canal area, and they decided instead to do a land invasion of this peninsula. Except by this point in time, the Ottomans kind of had enough of a head start. They highly suspected that this is what the Brits might attempt, because their navy mission had failed. And so they set up soldiers and defenses and all sorts along this peninsula. And if you look at the landscape of this peninsula, it goes kind of from the shore up to these high points. And so if you're setting up defensive positions, you have the massive high ground advantage against anyone landing on the shore. And so, to cut a long story short, when the French and British and Australian and New Zealanders, when they all arrived on this peninsula, they basically got destroyed and mowed down. They didn't make too much progress inland, except for some parts of the Australian forces. They didn't do too badly, which I'll give them that. But they, specifically the Australians, made some good headway, but partly because no one else did, and they didn't have any backup on their flanks. The Brits weren't making much headway in the south. The Australians had to end up ending their offensive position and digging trenches, setting up defensive positions, and they didn't really make much more headway inland. So once again, the same as the Western Front, this turned into a war of attrition, a war of trenches, and basically a massive stalemate. And so the Allied forces stayed in this battle. They stayed on this peninsula for almost 8 months, resulting in the casualties of around 200,000 men. After which they basically couldn't deal with it anymore. They evacuated, they left the peninsula, and they used these very interesting, very cool little contraptions, almost like a MacGyver style sort of thing, where they figured they couldn't just flee straight away because the Ottomans would pick up on, like, they haven't fired anything in a while. Perhaps they're trying to flee and then they would chase them down, shoot them in the back sort of thing. And so they made these little contraptions, which was kind of like a water clock, where water would drip down from one can into another, and once there was enough water in this other can, it would pull down the trigger of any of these guns, and the gun would then go off. So they set up multiple of these, they put them at different timings, and so every now and then the Ottomans would hear, you know, and that convinced them that the Allied forces were still there, which obviously allowed them to evacuate safely. So, very cool little contraption. But yeah, a completely failed campaign, tons of casualties, no ground made whatsoever, and just one of those things, I guess, where you can't win them all. And just one of the many losses by the Allies in the First World War. The execution of the Romanov family is something we did cover briefly a little earlier on, but due to the war being such a strain on Russia, and due to the royals, you know, the Tsars, the Romanov family, living the high life while all of their citizens starved, more or less, the people, with Lenin and the Bolsheviks and the communists, ended up revolting, ended up arresting the Romanovs and keeping them under house arrest. But at this first revolt, the communists and the Bolsheviks, for example, weren't really that powerful, so they weren't yet able to fully take over the government. But this was the new provincial government that was brought in. They were still kind of a normal government, they weren't the Bolsheviks or the communists, but they came in from all these revolts. They knew how unpopular the Tsars were, and so they said, look, in order to stop these revolts, in order to stop crazy war internally within Russia, we have to basically arrest the royal family. And they weren't too sure what to do with the royal family at this point. At first, they arrested them, they had them under house arrest, and I think initially they were planning on just sending them away to another country. They said, for sure, you can never rule Russia again. The people don't really want you to do that. But they also weren't going to kill the Romanovs. They were going to perhaps send them into exile, maybe send them over to some, family relations in Britain, for example. As the wife of this Tsar, Alexandra, the Tsarina, she was actually a granddaughter of Queen Victoria, that being Queen Victoria in England. So they absolutely were related. They had family connections in Britain, in England, and I think the initial plan was just to ship them all over there, to start a new government in Russia, and then to just more or less go from there. And so they initially put them under house arrest. They said, look, if we don't do something with you, the people are just going to revolt and kill you. So they set up a perimeter, they set up some defenses and security around the Romanovs. And then eventually, as the war continued and as more and more communist and Bolshevik revolutions were happening, they sent them out to somewhere further east that was more remote, that was safer from the front lines in case the Germans somehow ended up getting closer. And they put them in this large sort of mansion. Then time goes on, this provisional government isn't too popular either. The Bolsheviks and the communists start to get more and more control, more and more power, and eventually they are in full custody of the Romanovs. And the Romanovs' conditions started to get worse and worse, like their living conditions. Like initially they were living in this mansion, and then slowly they started to put up these really tall fences all the way around the mansion. And that was so that the Romanovs couldn't send signals to anyone, and also no one could send signals to the Romanovs. So they completely cut off all contact between the public and the Romanovs. They also kept mocking them, making crude gestures to the daughters of the family, and they also threatened to shoot them if they looked out of any of the windows, with them actually on several occasions thinking that one of the Romanovs was looking out a window, and so they just pulled out their gun and shot the wall next to them, forcing them to keep their eyes on the ground, don't look out the windows, and they seem to be insanely hyper-paranoid, which probably explains a lot of the development of the future government of, for example, Stalin. They were also then put on military rations, basic food that the soldiers were getting. They said you weren't allowed any luxuries, no fancy food, no large portions. They didn't give them butter or coffee. They said, as punishment, you're gonna live like all the rest of us. And now the state of Russia at this time was very precarious. As I said, the communists had taken over parts of the country, mostly being urban areas, but the anti-communists and the nationalists, which were called at the time the White Army, as well as a few other denominations, they were also fighting for control of Russia. And so even though the communists did currently have control of the Romanovs, they were afraid that the Russian army would take over the area, maybe free the Romanovs, and then use them to rally against the people, or rather rally the people against the communist revolutionaries and say, we don't want these communists taking over Russia, bring back the king. They've promised to sell all of their stuff, give it to the people. We need a royal family in Russia. And so the communists and the Bolsheviks absolutely didn't want to risk this. So they made a decision that it was best likely to just execute the entire family, including one of their dogs, the sick bastards, in order to remove all possibility of them being rescued and of the royal family being used against them. But they couldn't just do this willy-nilly, because if the people found out that they had executed the royal family, this could also hurt the Bolsheviks' cause. And so their plan, which they ended up actually going through with, was to get the whole family to bring them down into the basement of this house and to make this basement as soundproof as possible. So they boarded up the windows, they tried to stuff things into the windows to, drown out as much noise as possible. They also had a loud truck running in the courtyard, I don't have a very good truck impression, but they hoped that all of this would kind of drown out the gunshots and nobody would notice that the Romanovs were being killed. So then, with all of the Romanovs down in this basement, they brought down 12 men, all armed, and they proceeded to shoot all of the family members, including a bunch of the family's close workers. So, the carer of the family, the chef, etc. And it was honestly a very messy event. Firstly, these were, old guns, so they were super smoky. It almost immediately filled the room with a thick soot, a thick smoke in the air, and after really just a few shots, they couldn't really see anything. It was hard to breathe. Not all of the family members were actually hit, and the ones that were hit weren't necessarily dead. Some of them had been shot and just hadn't died from their wounds. Some of them had been shot in particular places where the bullets couldn't penetrate, which sounds weird, but we will get into that in just a little bit. And so they then had to go after these family members, sometimes shooting them again multiple times. Then they still didn't die. Then they went after them with bayonets and knives. And so what was supposed to be a execution that lasted a few seconds, bam, 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 everyone dead, ended up being a multi-minute long affair with gunshots and screaming, and then more gunshots, and then more screaming, and then bayonets, and it was nowhere near as sly or as slick as the Bolsheviks had expected. The people outside in nearby houses and in the nearby area heard most of these gunshots, and they knew that something was up, but the family members' bodies were then taken by truck, basically out into the middle of nowhere, and disposed of. So even though the people knew something was very suspicious here, they heard gunshots in the home and then didn't really know if the Romanovs were still alive or if they were dead or just what had happened. But after these Bolsheviks took the bodies of the Romanovs, they took them to a mine shaft in the middle of nowhere, they threw them down it, they covered it with acid in like an attempt to disfigure the people or the bodies, and this was so that nobody could recognize these people as being the Romanovs if they were indeed ever found. Then they tried to blow up the mine shaft with grenades, which didn't work, and so they pulled the bodies out of the mine shaft using rope, and they poured more acid on them, they separated them, they burnt them, crushed the bones and the skulls. It was really just an incredibly violent and brutal affair, and they were trying to basically make it impossible to identify any of the bodies. Eventually, years later, these bodies were found, this plot was uncovered, and so we do now know what happened to the Romanovs, with some of the recovered items from the burial site actually being on display to this day in Russia. But at the time, they weren't really sure what even happened to them. Obviously, back then they didn't have phones or the internet, and so communication was very slow and very hard to do. And so it was rumored that the Romanovs were in the house. There was maybe some gunshots, but people weren't really sure what it was, where it was from, whether the Romanovs were dead or not. And the Bolsheviks at the time, they kind of fed into this misinformation, spreading rumors that the Romanovs had escaped, or they had run out themselves into the woods and were never seen again, or taken by some random country around the world, and they were now living in exile on an island somewhere. And so at the time it really wasn't too well known exactly what happened to them and exactly what the Bolsheviks had done. The soldier who let Hitler go is, I think, quite a well-known story or rumor that this man, Private Henry Tandy of the British Army, spared a wounded Hitler, a young Hitler serving in the First World War. And this was when he was in the Bavarian Army as a lance corporal. And the story goes that Henry Tandy, who was apparently well known for sparing and saving enemy soldiers, especially if they were no threat to him or if they were injured, etc. And the story goes that he saw a young wounded Hitler in battle. He refused to kill him, and Hitler then went on to become the Hitler we obviously all know and definitely don't love. But this story later came about when Hitler saw a painting of this Henry Tandy, and in the painting he was rescuing soldiers. And then Hitler was like, hey, I kind of recognize that guy. He spared my life in World War I. But when Henry Tandy was asked about this, he said that, yeah, I spared many soldiers' lives over the years, but I don't specifically recall sparing this man's life, meaning Hitler's. So it could be true, perhaps, but it also could be a story/anecdote created by Hitler, in order to gin up the image of him being divinely chosen as a savior for the German people, that even God himself chose to indirectly spare Hitler and save his life during the First World War. There's also some evidence that Hitler wasn't even in this particular area around the time that he was serving, around the time that Henry was there. And so that, I think, further pushes this more towards the sort of myth and legend realm than to actual history. Bela Kish was an insane story. And this was this Hungarian man who was born in 1877, and he was at the time living in Cinkota in Budapest, or rather near Budapest. And by all accounts, he was a fairly likable, fairly handsome man, a hardworking individual who had his own business working with metals. It was mainly tin work, and he was making barrels or tools, etc. And as I said, he was quite well liked by his local area. He was friendly, he liked having a talk with people, he was very approachable, and honestly, just a very great guy. Except there was one small issue. Just one really small, really minor, tiny, barely even matters issue, and that was that he was a secret serial killer. Between 1900 and 1914, he was living in this one place, this property in Cinkota, and throughout most of the years, he was married to this woman named Marie Kish. Now, fast forward to 1912, Marie cheats on him, and she starts seeing this other man called Paul Bicari. And so, as a completely reasonable response, apparently, to this affair, Bela Kish kills both of these people and puts their bodies into barrels and fills them with alcohol and other chemicals in order to kind of pickle or preserve these individuals. And these become his first two known victims, which we're not entirely sure for certain if these were his first two victims, because it is thought with a psycho like this that he may have been killing people for years. But in terms of this time period in this particular area, in the bodies that were later found, these were the first two victims. But after this happened, he basically told his neighbors that, his wife had cheated on him and she had run off to America with this bloody man, and that it was a sad affair. They all took sympathy on him. And so now, as a single man, he would often date women, he would bring them around his house, he would put out advertisements for marriage, wife wanted for handsome, charming, rich, hard-working business owner with a dashing moustache. And strangely enough, over the years, these women just kept going missing. But obviously there was no cameras in those days, there was no social media, and Kish tended to pick women who were maybe from out of the area or who didn't have many family connections, who were perhaps a little more vulnerable. And this wasn't seen at the time as too suspicious from, his local neighbors, because from their perspective, he was just a guy who was kind of out on his luck. He kept dating women, he would bring one round, see her for a little while, then she would not be seen by anyone. And they might mention to Bela Kish, oh, what happened to, that other woman that you were seeing? And he would say, yeah, she didn't like me. She thought I dressed horribly or something. And so she decided to break it off. And this excuse kind of worked for a while. Not everyone is super successful in their dating life. But after a while, the neighbors started to get a little more suspicious. They were like, all right, this is kind of ridiculous. Every single woman that comes to your house just ends up never being seen again. And they also started to see these weird barrels pop up on the property. And really just before the war started, World War I, some of these neighbors did end up reporting him to the police. And this was specifically in regard to the missing women and to these strange barrels on his property. And the local police did investigate this. They went around, they spoke to Bela, and he even showed them the barrels and said that they were just filled with alcohol or filled with chemicals or filled with gasoline, because he was anticipating this big war to start and he just wanted to stockpile them, and so he was keeping them in barrels in his garden. And the police were kind of like, okay, that's reasonable enough. That checks out. And they didn't investigate this further. So around that time, not much else happened. World War II was started. Austria-Hungary was obviously at war with Serbia. And so Bela Kish was conscripted. He was sent out onto the front lines to fight for his country. And in around 1916, it was rumored, although there isn't too much evidence for this, but it was rumored that he had actually died on the front lines. And so because of this, his landlord thought that he was dead. And so they set about clearing out his place, you know, throwing out all of Bela Kish's stuff, making way for a clean, nice new property so that they could rent it out to someone else. And obviously on the property, the landlord discovered these barrels, and curiosity got the better of him. He ended up opening these barrels, and immediately this smell hit him, which was the unmistakable stench of human flesh. So he immediately contacted the police, and during their investigation, they actually came around, they saw the bodies in these barrels, and they ended up speaking with Kish's housekeeper, Mrs. Jakubek. And she said, you know, you must have the wrong guy. Bela was lovely, he was very hardworking, and he also had a secret room on the property, which he forbade me from ever entering under any circumstances. And they were like, yeah, that's a little bit suspicious. We should probably check this room. And so she led them to the room, they cracked the door open, and inside they found all sorts of stuff, which importantly, they didn't find any bodies, but they did find a bunch of chemicals, a bunch of tools. They found empty barrels. They found biology books on, you know, how the bodies work, where the blood vessels and the veins go around the body. They found books on poisoning, how to make poisons, how to use them. And yeah, stuff like shovels, and it's just a really suspicious room. And on the property, upon further searches, they found buried all over the grounds, under the ground, these tin barrels, and inside the tin barrels, they found human remains, they found chemicals and preservatives, and this totaled to around 24 different bodies, most of whom had been strangled to death and preserved in alcohol and chemicals. And this gained Kish the dark moniker of the Hungarian Pickler. So upon discovering all of these bodies, an immediate call was put out to the army saying like, bro, if you find Bela Kish alive, like somehow, somewhere, he should immediately be arrested and detained and possibly even just killed there on the spot. But he never was. There were also rumors that he never died in the war and that he used the chaos and mayhem of the war to basically make his getaway. And despite potential multiple sightings over the years, these were never really confirmed, and so we don't really know whether he did die in the war or whether he ran away, fled to another country, and just changed his name, changed his appearance perhaps. And if he did survive, whether he stopped killing then or whether he continued to kill wherever he was living, which is just an absolutely terrifying thought. That's nice. But if you are enjoying the video, please do leave a like and subscribe to help me with my goal of 100,000 subscribers. Also, hype the video, as apparently that's a thing now. And of course, do enjoy the rest of the video. The lost treasure of the Tsars. So we covered this briefly above. If you'll recall, I briefly touched on it without really mentioning it, but we mentioned the execution of the Romanov family, and we mentioned when they were shot in the end that some of them were shot in places that deflected the bullets. And this was because, as you can imagine, the Tsars were insanely wealthy. They had lands, they had properties, they had jewels and treasures, and so when they went from their home in the west, when they were put under house arrest, when they were moved further east, they took a lot of specifically gems and jewels with them, just because these were smaller, they were easier to carry and hide, and so a lot of the family ended up having gems basically woven into their clothes, whether this was into their jacket or corset or basically their underwear, their undergarments. And so for a few of the bullets that were fired that night, they did actually end up deflecting off some of these jewels within the clothes, and they temporarily saved a few members of the family. Obviously, they were all killed almost immediately after that, but that just goes to show how rich the Tsars were. And when the Bolsheviks and the communists came into power, they found that the Tsars had basically done a lot of the gathering work for them, because at the start of the war, the royal family basically got a little bit scared that, okay, what if Germany does actually kind of invade us? We don't want them getting any of their hands on any of the jewelry or treasure that's in other cities. And so they basically took all of the expensive stuff and they moved it all to their home. So when the Bolsheviks took over, it was just all there waiting for them, except when the royal family was put under house arrest, when they were moved out east. As I said, they did take a bunch of their stuff with them, mostly in the form of gems, jewels, diamonds, that sort of thing. And that was also to say nothing about the gold reserves in Russia, which were at the time the third largest gold reserves in the entire world. And it was all kept in this one city of Kazan. And there was some bamboozlery around this time where they originally stored it all in Kazan. The communists were trying really hard to take over control of Kazan, and then when they eventually did, they went in there and there was no gold, no treasures, as really it had all been moved secretly out further east. But it didn't really make a difference. In the end, the communists ended up winning this civil war, and so they got full control over all of these riches. But what was initially over like 650 million gold rubles, which would be worth an estimated $100 billion in today's money, it was only around 250 million rubles by the time the Bolsheviks actually got their hands on it, meaning that over 450 million rubles, or around 50 to 60 billion dollars in today's money worth of gold, was then missing. And this was just one of the missing or lost treasures of Russia in World War II. You also had lots of other treasures and fine artworks, like for example the Fabergé eggs, which are each worth millions of dollars today. And you had vast amounts of personal wealth from the Tsars in the form of trinkets, jewelry, scepters, gems that was seemingly never recovered or accounted for. A lot of the wealth was taken by the Bolsheviks when they took over and then sold to other foreign nations in order to basically liquidate all the wealth of the Tsars and to pump it back into the communist state, or probably more realistically into the pockets of the communist leaders. But as I said, there is still a vast amount of wealth and treasures from specifically the Romanovs that is today unaccounted for. We don't currently have it. We haven't seen them in many, many years, and we just don't know what ended up happening to them. And it's quite interesting because when the Romanovs were under house arrest, when they were imprisoned over in the East, very few people were actually allowed to visit them or see them or even speak with them. But some of the people who were allowed were some of the sisters or the nuns from this local monastery. And there was at least one proven example where the Mother Superior of the local Tobolsk Ivanovki monastery actually met with the Tsar's wife, the Tsarina Alexandra, while she was imprisoned. And Alexandra actually gave her a bunch of gems and jewels for safekeeping. And this Mother Superior ended up agreeing to take them. She took them out of the house, she passed them on to a few different people, and eventually they were hidden inside the Tobolsk monastery. The stash was eventually found by communists in 1933 after much interrogation and interviews and perhaps some coercion, but they did find the stash, which does confirm, the Tsars had a bunch of stuff with them, and they were hoping to hide them and keep them secret. So it does raise the question of what else Alexandra might have given, any nuns or whatever that came in, because this was only like one of them that were found. We don't know if there were more instances of this. And a really cool example of a gem that I found was one diamond, which was a bloody huge diamond, almost 100 carats. And this diamond alone would have been enough to finance entire armies and ships secretly, possibly billions of dollars worth in the country that they had escaped to. And so if they managed to escape this house arrest, if they managed to flee the country and then give just this gem over to the leader of that country, they would likely have been able to rally this huge army, this huge force, or relatively big, just enough to defend the family at least, and then force their way through Europe into the safety of England. But they were obviously never able to do that. They weren't given the opportunity to escape, and so the mystery of the Tsar's lost treasures, wherever they may be today, is still an unsolved mystery to this day. The USS Cyclops will be a very short entry, but this was basically this ship which was converted for the war into carrying shipments for the US Navy. It mainly carried fuel, so coal, some other shipments, and manganese in particular, which was used as an ore for smelting steel, resulting in basically a more pure and durable form of steel. So this ship, it went down to collect a shipment of manganese in Brazil, and it was planning to bring it back up into the United States. And all seemed to be going fairly somewhat well until it had to stop off in Barbados because it was concerned about being overloaded. As at the time it was carrying a shipment of around 11,000 tons of manganese, which was well above its recommended limit of 8,000 tons. And then, after leaving Barbados, the ship was simply never seen again. And it was headed up to Baltimore in Maryland, which, let me just get a map out here. Draw a line between the two. Holy shit. I think I know what happened. And that was one of the theories, of course. But it is, in my eyes, I would say a pretty standard disappearance. You know, it was a ship in World War I that was clearly massively overloaded in an area that is well known for having shaky waters and or storms, and there was apparently a reported heavy storm in the area at the time. So it's not too shocking. I don't think you need to be Sherlock Holmes in order to figure out what might have happened with this ship. But with the loss of this ship, that also meant the loss of around 306 passengers, or rather, you know, sailors, workers, which made this the largest loss of life for a single US Navy ship, specifically outside of combat in all of US Navy history. The lone gunner of Flesquières. So as you might remember, the British especially used tanks throughout World War I. Very basic tanks, mind, but still tanks. And at a place called Flesquières, which was in France, there were hundreds of these tanks deployed, as many as like 500. And there was a little legend woven into history about a German soldier who, despite the rest of his crew fleeing and running away back behind the moving lines, he stayed at his post and single-handedly apparently destroyed 37 British tanks by himself before, of course, he was killed. And honestly, there's not a whole lot of documented evidence for this, and attempts to identify a particular soldier for this have mostly all but failed. And so it is kind of an old war rumor, a whisper, trench gossip sort of thing. But nevertheless, the tanks were pretty cool. And speaking of tanks, we have the mobile personal shield, or personnel shield. And this was a shield that kind of looked like a tank, but it was, as the name suggests, basically a shield on wheels that was used very sparingly throughout World War I, where you could basically wheel around this chunk of a thing and mostly be impervious to enemy fire. And the problem was, there was a few problems, but just to name a few, it was very heavy, it was a little bit unreliable, it was slow moving, you couldn't really get it over any substantial terrain, like hills, dents in the ground, barbed wire, slightly rocky floor or road. So it was very ineffective for actually moving, and it wasn't really even that safe. Like, yes, it would protect you from a few bullets, a few shrapnel explosions, but against sustained machine gun fire, it wasn't going to hold up at all. And some of these weren't even fully enclosed, so you could still get hit from the sides, and also they could be targeted by direct shrapnel hits or mortars or artillery strikes, and so it really just wasn't worth using them, at least in any widespread sense. So yeah, a very cool piece of technology, I think. You know, you've always got to push the boundaries in wars like this, but yeah, at the same time, not really that effective. The Spanish flu spread. So the Spanish flu was just awful. It was a flu that spread just towards the end of the war, and it affected roughly 1/3 of the entire world, killing an estimated 50 to 100 million people worldwide, which, to put into perspective, in its totality, as gruesome and brutal and horrific as it was, World War I itself only killed around 15 to 20 million people. So then, after all of that killing, after all of that brutality, just when the people thought that they were putting an end to this war, getting a break from all the death, this flu then comes along and kills 3 to 5 times as many people as this war did. So it was incredibly brutal. It spread partly due to the conditions of the war, due to the cramped spaces of the soldiers and the fact that people were being shipped all around the world, back to their own countries. So perhaps an outbreak in Germany would spread over to France, and then when the British Indian soldiers went back to British India or back to Australia or to New Zealand, that would further spread the flu, meaning it was kind of a worldwide thing. And due to the way this particular flu worked, it tended to be worse on younger people with better immune systems. Because what would happen is people would catch the flu, their body would kind of go into overdrive trying to defend against the flu, and then this would cause inflammatory problems, basically having the immune system kill itself. So very terrifying, honestly, a very scary flu, and particularly strange that it killed younger people at a higher rate than either very young people like children or older people, and that was the Spanish flu. Anastasia Grave is a reference to the fact that during the execution of the Romanov family, Anastasia and Alexei, the two youngest children of the Tsars, were buried separately from the other family members. This was, at the time, apparently an attempt to basically confuse anyone who found the bodies. If they found these two people on their own, they might not think they were connected to the royal family at all, which it was a pretty weak attempt, quite honestly, but that is why these bodies were separated. But partly because of this, there were rumors ever since the Romanovs were killed that Anastasia in particular had escaped, had made it to America, for example, or to Britain, or to somewhere in the Nordic countries, and was laying low, had a small job somewhere, had changed her hair color, had been learning an English or American accent. And as I said, that was part of the rumors at the time. But since then, all of the bodies have been dug up. They've been tested for DNA, and they were all confirmed to be the Romanov family, with each body they found sadly linking up to each family member, meaning that Anastasia was found buried here, despite all of the rumors over the past 100 or so years. And in fact, I even covered a alternate history in one of my alternate history Iceberg videos, exploring what the world might look like if Anastasia was confirmed to have escaped, and to possibly bring back the Romanov family into Russia, which is a very interesting alt history. And if you like alternate histories, absolutely check out the Iceberg, which I will link down below. Mata Hari was a woman who was born as Margaretha or Margaretha Gertrude Zell. This was in the Netherlands in 1876. She had a fairly uneventful younger life, I would say, but when she was 18 years old, she responded to a newspaper advertisement by a Dutch army captain, Rudolf MacLeod, who was advertising asking for a wife, and they apparently hit it off quite well. They were soon married, and she was then living with Rudolf in Indonesia, and eventually ended up having 2 kids with him. So time goes on, Rudolf ends up being a womanizer, an abuser, constantly cheating on her with the maid, drinking every day, and eventually the two ended up getting a divorce. So Margaretha moves back to Paris, and she starts working and performing in a circus, and she was well known for her exotic dances. And it was around this time that she started to formally, kind of publicly take on the persona and name of matahari, meaning the eye of the day in Indonesian, and obviously performing as an erotic dancer and model. This then caught the media's eye, and she was soon performing for the high and mighty, the rich, the nobility, and this was all around 1903, 1904, so a good 10 years before the start of World War I. Then World War I does start, and since the Netherlands is a neutral country, this allowed Matahari to travel around mostly unbothered. She was allowed into France, obviously she was allowed into the Netherlands, also into Britain, also into Germany, and she was mostly, as I said, unbothered. And this, it was spotted by some higher-ups, made her an incredible valuable asset to the war, and particularly to the French. And the French basically took her aside, and for a few reasons which we won't really dive into, she was at the time dating a Russian guy. This Russian guy was fighting in France. He was injured on the front lines, and the only way they would let her see him was if she agreed to do some covert work for the French. So she agreed to this. She went into Germany to do some sexy dancing for some prominent Germans, captains, commanders, politicians, etc. And two, if she could, try and get some information from them that the French could use. So she ended up doing all this, but while she was over there, she accepted a large payment from the Germans. So at this point, it wasn't entirely clear where her loyalties lay. Like, maybe she was taking this money from the Germans in order to not be suspicious to them. Maybe she was doing that to line her own pockets and she was still on the side of France. Or maybe she had taken this as a bribe from the Germans in order to spy on France and do like a reverse spy sort of thing. And it's not really clear exactly why she took the money, for what purpose, exactly where her loyalties lay. She was a bit like Snape in Harry Potter, I guess. And at the time, during all this, she did exchange some information. She gave some French secrets or information over to Germany. She gave some German information over to France, with her apparently telling each side that, yes, I did give them some information about you, but that was really just to gain their trust. Like, I'm really on your side. And so, around this time, Germany sent a coded radio message to Berlin describing in detail Matahari and saying that she was a great spy for spying with us, spying on the French. She gave us loads of information, and they described her in a way where this description could only be Matahari. And they didn't call her by name, but they referred to her as Agent H21. And so, as I said, the Germans sent this message over to Berlin. The French intercepted it, even though the message was encoded. The Germans chose to use a coding system that they knew the French had already cracked. So it's very strange. We're not entirely sure why the Germans did this, whether the Germans knew that she was spying for France, and so they just wanted to get rid of her, to rat her out to the French, but in this more indirect manner. And so they used a description that only could have been Matahari. They complimented her and said, yes, she's spying for the Germans, the silly French don't even know about it. And they encoded it in a way that they knew the French could uncode or decode. And so that is basically what happened. The French intercepted this message, they decoded it, they realized that they were referencing Matahari, and so at the next possible available time, they ended up arresting Matahari, where she was accused basically of espionage, and even though there was no real physical or documented evidence for this espionage, they said that the information that she had given to the Germans cost thousands of lives of French individuals, French citizens, French soldiers, and so she was put to death via firing squad. And it was thought also that the French might have been using her as some sort of scapegoat. So like these tactics that they might have tried, maybe they failed, maybe they were stupid decisions, but by sentencing Matahari for espionage, they were able to say, it was a good decision, but obviously the Germans didn't fall for it because you leaked the information first to the Germans, and that is why we failed the mission or the battle or what have you. So she was soon convicted for these crimes, and it was said that she was the cause for the deaths of 50,000 soldiers, which was really just an absurd number with like no basis or grounding for. And on the day of her firing squad, she showed one last act of badassery and refused the blindfold that they typically offer on a firing squad execution. And just before she was killed, she blew all the soldiers a kiss, and then she was shot to death with rifles. So was she really guilty of all this? It's hard to say. She could have been like double crossing, triple crossing sort of thing, 4D chess, but it's not clear that this was even agreed upon by either side at the time. So that is the story of Mata Hari. A Bible shielded a man is a reference to the many occasions throughout World War I where, as it says, a Bible literally shielded a man, often from severe injury or even death. And they were normally pocket Bibles, kept in the breast pockets of their uniforms. And there were a few actual fairly well documented, fairly well noted occasions of this. Some of them being, for example, Frederick Peel, or Pale, whose Bible stopped a German machine gun round, Leslie Friston, whose Bible stopped 2 bullets, and Leonard Knight, George Vinnell, and the list just goes on. And these Bibles were often then kept as family heirlooms. They were very, very important to the individuals. They were seen as a sign of God directly protecting them, and sometimes even caused these soldiers to fully devote their lives to Christianity and to Jesus, with some of them becoming long-term missionaries. Tier 4, Who Shot the Red Baron, is a very interesting reference to the Red Baron, who was this guy, Manfred von Richthofen, who was dubbed the Ace of Aces when it came to flying in World War I. He was reportedly responsible single-handedly for over 80 aerial battle victories and for taking out countless Allied planes and pilots, with obviously his plane being painted bright red, hence the name Red Baron, which stricken fear into the hearts and minds of the Allied pilots. And he wasn't just always alone. He did have his crew, his gang, and he encouraged them to also paint their planes various colors, and for some of them to also paint their planes red, so that when he was in the air, it wasn't, super obvious that there was one red plane, and so everyone would just shoot that one red plane. He didn't want that, so he had a few different red planes flying with him at a time, and this gang or group became known as the Flying Circus due to them obviously flying and to the bright colors of their planes, which incidentally, that's what the Monty Python's Flying Circus was actually named after. But on the German side, he was an absolute legend. On the Allied side, he was obviously an absolute terror, and the Red Baron was eventually taken down by, we don't exactly know who. The main guy who was originally suspected of taking down the Red Baron was a man named Captain Arthur Roy Brown of the British Royal Air Force, who was flying around chasing the Red Baron in an aerial battle. And just as the Red Baron just as he went down, that's when Captain Brown was fighting him. So it was just assumed that he was the one who took him down. But after analyzing all this and investigating it with bullet trajectories, they determined that it was very unlikely that it was Captain Brown, and it was very much more likely that it was a machine gunner on the ground, which for that there were a few different people, machine gunners that it could have been, but it was never really pinpointed on an individual. And so the mystery still remains of really who took out the Red Baron. And so I think just a very cool entry. I love the idea and the style of the character. And even though he may technically be a bad guy, I think he had skill, he had style, he had gall and bravery, and he was just really representing his country. So yeah, What a lad. The Angel of the Mons, or Mons if you're not French. But this entry involves a battle called the Battle of the Mons, which was really a very cool battle and very pivotal, especially for the start of World War I. And as you know, Germany is fighting France. They are fighting them on the front lines. Germany then forces its way into neutral Belgium, which causes Britain to go, hey, wait a minute, you can't park there, mate. You can't do that. And so they send in the BEF, or British Expeditionary Force, over to France and Belgium in order to push Germany back. And this British force is like some of the best Britain has to offer at the time. And they jump right in, heading through France into Belgium, and they basically push the Germans out. And this is where we start the Battle of Mons. And Mons was a city in Belgium, and it is where the Brits and the Germans basically then came to blows. And as I said, it's a really cool battle. The Brits were destroying the Germans, with accounts from Germans that they thought the Brits were actually using machine guns just because of how fast and accurate the Brits were. But really, they were actually just using regular old rifles, which shows just how skilled this particular British army group was. And they fought off the Germans, killing around 3 times as many Germans as the Brits lost. But in the end, the force of the Germans was just too much. They had too many numbers against the British. And so eventually the British soldiers had to make their retreat. But retreat at this time in this particular battle was very risky. And it meant turning your back on the enemy, meaning they could flank you, they could advance into different positions around you, they could shoot you in the back. It was and still is a very risky thing to do. But it is said that just as they were retreating, according to some witnesses, a bright light engulfed the area. And some say it was a group of like ethereal, angelic archers who fired arrows at the Germans, blowing up their trenches or what have you. And others say that it was a brightly lit cloud or fog. And still others say that it was just complete nonsense. That it was either a hallucination or some rumor or a bit of war propaganda, and that it never actually really happened. But either way, whether it did or didn't happen, the BEF successfully retreated, and while they did lose a fair few men in this retreat, it was not honestly as bad as it potentially could have been. So, myth or legend, mass psychosis or delusion, aliens, perhaps, or in fact divine intervention? Let me know what you think about this entry and what actually happened down below. Trench rats were absolutely horrible. But as you can imagine, as I spin you a tale, so picture the scene. You're a soldier in World War I in these horrible conditions down in the trenches. It's cold, it's wet, you haven't slept properly or eaten properly in days. Your comrades and brothers are being blown up and shot. There is constant artillery fire dropping on you from above, from nearby. Your ears are just ringing. It's absolutely hell. There's diseases going around the trench. And on top of that, you have these rats that are as big as cats by some accounts, completely flooding the trenches, nibbling you as you sleep, spreading rat disease. They all have rat desire, and they're living off your food, off disposed food, and also off fallen soldiers that they can find basically anywhere in no man's land in the trenches. And they are an absolute menace, with one pair of rats being able to produce almost 900 offspring in a single year. So it was obviously a major problem. And they would do shit like eat candles, which doesn't even seem like a thing rats should want to do. Like, it's a bloody candle, but it feels like they were just torturing the soldiers. You would set up lights all in the trenches, the rats would come up, eat the candle would fall on the floor, go out. They would eat their way into cans of food, and especially if you had just normal dry food that wasn't protected, like as if these soldiers needed even more suffering. Sergeant Stubby. Now, what I'm about to tell you is absolutely amazing, and it might sound made up, but it is all completely true. And this is the story of Little Stubby, who was a dog, a bull terrier mix, that apparently had no owner, and in 1917 wandered into a military training grounds in Connecticut, where he was found and later adopted by Private Robert Conroy. He was then smuggled aboard the SS Minnesota, which was a US Navy ship headed to France, and this apparently went against all regulations at the time, but they got away with it by hiding him inside of an overcoat. Then they arrived in France, and it is here that Little Stubby first sees combat, fighting at Chemin des Dames, which I'm not too sure if I got that pronunciation right, but he was there fighting with his fellow soldiers under constant fire for over a month. He then participated in a raid at Seicheprey, where he suffered a wound in his front leg, and this was when he was hit by a grenade. And he was also injured by breathing in mustard gas, but then in July of that year fought in a few fairly major battles, including the Second Battle of the Marne and the capture of Chateau Thierry. He lived around these soldiers. He would constantly sniff out mustard gas before anyone else could detect it, and then he would alert the soldiers of this, or he would hear the whistle of artillery shells dropping, and again this was before the soldiers were able to detect it. So he would hear very, very subtly. He would start barking, he would run for cover, all the soldiers would follow him, and then these bombs would drop. So he saved many lives doing that as well. And, I mean, the list honestly just goes on here, but he would often sniff out wounded soldiers in no man's land, bringing them medical supplies and leading medics to their location. And he even at one point sniffed out a German soldier who was sneaking around their trenches, mapping them out, and it is said that he chased the soldier, he harassed him, and he held him until help arrived. I am just absolutely in love with this dog. And for all of this, he was actually promoted to sergeant, being the first ever dog to receive a military rank in the US. And after all of this, after the war ended, Stubby returned to the US with Conroy until he sadly died in 1926, being memorialized as America's most decorated war dog. And if you do nothing else today, can you at least please leave a #Stubby down in the comments below? Thank you, and that is all. The Cottingley fairies. Are these very obviously real fairies? I don't see how anyone could even say otherwise. But they were photographed by 9-year-old Francis Griffiths, and that's a bloody hard name to say, Griffiths, and 16-year-old Elsie Wright, who were cousins living together in Cottingley in England, and it was just before the end of World War I that these two girls apparently saw these fairies in their garden and decided to take some photographs of them. And this was, as I said, in 1917, but shortly after the war in 1920, Elsie's mother showed the photographs at her local Theosophical Society meeting. And Theosophy is kind of like a spiritual religion. It's kind of like Christianity, but more spiritual, slightly magical, slightly fanciful sort of thing. And she showed it there, where they were really impressed by these fairies. And so then this somehow got around to Sir Arthur Conan Doyle, the guy who wrote Sherlock, and he was so pleased with them that he ended up publishing the photographs alongside an article in the Strand magazine, and said that he can completely vouch for their authenticity, and that he believed that they were a true sign and evidence of spirituality, of God, of magic, and from there they just became more and more popular. And this was obviously just after World War I, when everyone at the time was, as you can imagine, kind of heartbroken, sad, tired, injured. Most families had lost someone, be it a son or a father or a cousin. It was a really crummy time. And I think this little spark of magic, this childishness, this awe, beauty, mystery, divine, was perhaps what everyone in Britain wanted and ultimately deserved. But it wasn't until the 1960s and 70s that these two girls, now, middle-aged women, hinted that yes, perhaps these may have been a hoax, and they may or may not have been created with cardboard cutouts and drawings and designs and photographic trickery. Who would have thought? And so, to this day, these fairies remain I think, little blip of magic in the dark, dark times that was post-World War I Britain. Mercy Dog. So, you know how we just covered little Sergeant Stubby? Well, he wasn't the only dog that served in the First World War. In fact, around 10 to 20,000 dogs served in World War I, and they were often known as mercy dogs. And reading about these is just so bloody cool. Like, I absolutely love dogs. But these dogs were trained specifically for this purpose. Like, they were actually bred and put into school in Britain, which a few of them were called the British War Dog School. And then they were shipped out to the front lines to live with and help with the soldiers who were out there fighting. And this wasn't just Britain, this was France as well, also Australia, New Zealand, but also it wasn't limited to just the Allies. The Germans also had their own mercy dogs, and they would often head out into no man's land, sniffing along with their little dog snouts, and they would move silently, sometimes at night, and they would find and locate wounded soldiers. And these dogs didn't just come empty-handed. They carried these little packs on their back, and they were filled with alcohol, with water, with first aid kits, and so any soldiers that they found would be able to stitch up perhaps minor wounds. Maybe if they had a bullet that hit them somewhere, they could disinfect it with the alcohol, they could sew themselves back up. And if they found a wounded soldier who could be saved, they were trained to rip off a piece of its uniform or to take a piece from the soldier giving it to them, and then they would head back to base, and when the medics came out to help the soldiers, these dogs would lead the way, and they would lead them directly to some of the wounded soldiers. And if the man they found couldn't be saved, they would just sit there with them in their final moments, providing softness, providing warmth, and providing the dog comfort, which we have all known to grow and love. They would sometimes as well be in the right conditions to be able to drag a man to safety. And as I said, with around 10 to 20,000 mercy dogs serving in the war, they saved an estimated, it is thought, 6 to 8,000 men. And for some honorable mentions, some especially good boys, there was Prusco, which was a French dog credited with saving more than 100 men in a single battle. He dragged multiple men off to safety, all on his own, which is just insane. There was Stiff or Steiff, who was a German dog awarded with the Iron Cross, which is a German military medal for bravery. After, and I think I might cry, but after he ran out, he dragged a wounded lieutenant back to safety under active gunfire, despite this dog being shot twice and having both of his bloody front legs being broken. He dragged his master, this lieutenant, back to safety. They were both then rescued, they were both operated on, and both this dog, Steiff, and his master ended up surviving. There was also a French dog named Captain, who located 30 wounded soldiers in a single day. And when I was reading this, I thought it said that he wounded 30 soldiers in a single day, which that would have been a completely different achievement. That would have been like a John Wick dog or something, which is kind of ironic in and of itself. And finally, our little man, Sergeant Stubby, who was not officially trained as a mercy dog, but did a fantastic job all the same. I bloody love dogs. The Florentine diamond is one of those pieces of jewelry or treasures lost to time, because it was, before World War I, part of the Austrian crown jewels and passed down through the generations. And this gorgeous yellow 137 carat diamond that, after Austria-Hungary lost World War I, was taken along with a bunch of other precious jewels and gems by Karl I, the Emperor of Austria-Hungary. And this is when he left the throne, he abdicated his position, and he went to live with his family in Switzerland. But after this, the diamond seems to more or less have disappeared. There are some claims that it was stolen by someone, during the move, and then either sold off to someone in America or in Britain in order to raise money for him and his family. But either way, we don't know what happened to it. We don't know if it was lost, or if it was cut down into smaller pieces and then sold, or if it was just sold as one big piece. The Passchendaele mud drownings. So we've gone over a few things in World War I so far, and a few of the horrors, the trenches, the running over the top into oncoming machine gun fire, diseases, non-stop artillery, bloody rats. But to add to that list, there is mud. Like the worst mud you can possibly imagine. And the worst of these muds was perhaps in the Battle of Passchendaele, sometimes known as the Third Battle of Ypres, where near Ypres in Belgium, this particular area was quite low-lying. So it was the opposite of the top of a hill, and that meant that all the other higher areas around the area, all of the water flow and rivers and canals and streams, they would eventually naturally converge in this area. And it didn't help that a bunch of these streams were being blown up, so the water was being redirected. It also didn't help that the area was facing its worst rainfall in about 30 years, which is just like, yeah, why not? And so very, very wet conditions mixed with artillery bombings all over the place created an absolute wasteland of mud. So you absolutely could not walk in this area. And even when they put down these kind of wooden panels all over the place, there were still accounts of soldiers either slipping on them and then drowning in the mud, or, you lose your way, you're perhaps walking this at night, you take just one wrong step and you're in this crazy suction of mud. You're up to your waist in puddly mud, and you end up just sinking and drowning, with multiple accounts of people actually falling into them and just being swallowed whole. So you can imagine you're being shot at in these crazy conditions. Maybe you're running away, you're panicking, and then you fall into the mud. No one else around can really help you. Either they're shot as well or whatever, and you may or may not have been shot. You may or may not be bleeding or injured, but you are just stuck in this cold mud, slowly sinking as the day gets darker and darker, and it is just absolutely horrifying to imagine. And I don't even need to remind you that there were rats all over the place. And one of the worst noted examples of this was in the first Battle of Passchendaele, where a whole group of New Zealand soldiers ended up getting trapped in the mud. They were pinned down by German gunfire, and so they couldn't even really move. And as it was raining, over 840 of them were left there in the mud, either dead or dying on that day. Bonus entry, Khudadad Khan. So this was actually the first Indian soldier to be awarded the Victoria Cross for his bravery. And this was while fighting against the Germans in the Battle of Ypres. And his story was just insane. He was part of a roughly 4 to 6 man machine gun crew. And as you can imagine, when you're in a crew, you might have 1 or 2 people firing the gun, swapping in and out, taking turns for various reasons. You might have a few defending your position. You might have a few more reloading ammo or just moving bits around. But at this point in the battle, all of his allies were dead. The Germans had killed most of the people around this entire area, and so it just left him alone on this machine gun versus large groups of Germans. And any normal, sane person might say, look, I'm not winning this. Perhaps it's best to either retreat or to just surrender to the Germans. But Kudadad Khan was not just a normal man. Despite being wounded quite badly, he still gave the Germans hell, completely raining fire on their positions whenever they tried to come out, and doing everything himself, reloading the gun himself, ducking for cover, and then keeping up the gunfire. And he was able to do this consistently until Allied reinforcements arrived and further secured their position. So single-handedly, he was able to hold the position and to stop German advancement, and all of this while being alone and badly injured. So yeah, hell yes, this guy deserves a medal. Tier 5, the Lost Battalion. So this is quite a long topic, and it's an epic story, and there are full-length videos about this that you can find online, which I would highly recommend if it sounds interesting to you. But this was towards the tail end of World War I, after the Americans arrived. And at the time, the British, the French, and the Americans, and obviously many other nations, but they were basically fighting back along the Germans, forcing them back into Germany. And the plan was that all of these divisions here would make a push against the Germans, and by doing this they would then gain some ground. The only problem was, even though it didn't really seem like a problem at the time, but Major Charles W. Whittlesey, who was in charge of the 77th Division, he made his way forward. He faced surprisingly little pushback from the Germans, and after a while he found that he had gained a surprising amount of space in a surprising amount of time, with very few casualties in his division of around 650 men. But what Whittlesey and his men didn't know at the time was that he and his men had just pushed through the German forces, and they were now behind enemy lines because the route that he and his men took was a completely unseen, unknown gap in the German defenses, which neither the Allied forces or the Germans had initially noticed. So his division kind of buckled down, they set up their defenses. The Germans didn't yet know that they were there, and even though they were at their objective, they soon started to notice that neither of its flanks had successfully pushed up. And slowly, as the Germans started to notice him and his men being there, he was then trapped behind enemy lines with no flank support and with Germans on all sides. So, as I said, they did the next best sensible thing, and they quickly dug in. With some accounts, this one by Private Julius Langer of Company H, and he says, "I was alone in the hole I dug. I had only a mess kit spoon and a bayonet to dig with, but it is wonderful how fast one can dig when bullets are whistling around. There was dirt flying in all directions for a few minutes, and it was everyone for themselves." And another account by Lieutenant Eager, the lieutenant in charge of G Company had dug him out a nice foxhole, and he was sitting down there and it looked like he was safe. And Lieutenant Harrington, who went up there with me, and I was standing there talking to him. He was sitting down in his foxhole with rock piled up in front of him, which he had dug out in digging his foxhole, and it looked like good protection. While we were standing there, a German grenade thrown from above the road on top of the hill came down there and landed right on the rocks and just cut his face to pieces. Lieutenant Harrington got a slug through the shoulder of it, but I did not get a scratch, although I was standing just as close as any of them. I took over the company from then on, being the ranking officer. And so you can imagine what it was like at this time. They then sent out a small force of 58 men back along the way that they had just come, and they were basically trying to see if there was a path out back to the Allied lines, or just to assess the situation, or to pass on a message sort of thing, or to just give this division some intel perhaps on German positions. But it ended up being an absolute bloodbath. They stumbled across many Germans. Machine gun fire hit them from all sides. You know, the flanks, the front, the back. There was artillery from above. And by the time the group returned to the rest of the division, 40 of the 58 that originally went out there were now dead. And there's even this quote from one of the soldiers themselves about this short mission. On the morning of October 3rd, just before daylight, my company was ordered back to the position where on the preceding day we had assaulted and driven the Germans from their trenches. And that left companies D and F. Our mission was to bring those two companies up to the rest of the 1st and 2nd battalions of the 308th Infantry. As we started back, we were attacked by a machine gun on the hill on our right. This machine gun was silenced and the crew taken prisoner. Then we proceeded on toward our objective, and just before we reached it, we were fired upon from each flank and from the front. The Germans were to the right of us and to the left of us, and to the front of us. They attempted to close in behind us, but a small portion of my company, myself and 17 others, succeeded in fighting our way through the lines behind us, while another portion succeeded in pushing its way towards the trench. I reported to Major Whittlesey upon my return what I had found. And so, with no real way to leave this area, they had been surrounded on all sides, the battalion decided just to dig in and to fight for as long as possible. They were bombarded with artillery, although thankfully due to their position, which was on the side of this ravine, it was rather hard for the Germans to actually accurately hit them. But they also faced constant machine gun fire, they faced barrages of grenades thrown at them from all angles, and over the next 6 days, it was a mad effort just to stay alive. They fought back valiantly, not surrendering, and not giving the Germans an easy time either. They sent out runners or messengers. You know, think of them kind of like the scouts of old. And these were people who were really trained in terms of cardio. They were very swift movers, and they also had really good senses of direction. They were able to read maps incredibly well. And the plan was to send out runners back along the way they came and to give a message to their allies that they had broken through the enemy lines, they were still alive, and that they needed some reinforcements. But sadly, out of all the runners that they sent out, none of them ever returned. They also tried sending out messenger pigeons, with the first pigeon reading, "Many wounded, we cannot evacuate." The second read, "Men are suffering, can support be sent?" But none of these messages actually ended up going to the Allies, because every time they were sent up, the Germans would spot them and they ended up shooting them out of the sky. And it was during this time that the Allied troops were actually firing mortars and artillery down on Whittlesey and his men. And this was because, as you can see from this image of the landscape, it was very hard to see through, very hard to pinpoint an actual location, and since none of the messages had got back to the Allies, from the Allies' perspective, this division was probably already dead or captured, and so these artillery strikes were just being fired down on the Germans. But as a result of these friendly artillery strikes, there were over 110 casualties and 30 deaths of Whittlesey's men. And that was when Whittlesey sent out his last and only remaining messenger pigeon, and he was named Cher Ami. And he wrote on this message, "We are along the road parallel to 276.4. Our own artillery is dropping a barrage directly on us. For heaven's sake, stop it." And little Cher Ami, that bloody great pigeon, he flew, and he flew fast. Out into the open, the Germans did spot this bird. They tried shooting the bird, they tried taking it down with shrapnel fire, and despite being shot through the breast and blinded in one eye and having his right leg almost severed by a bullet or piece of shrapnel, despite suffering all of these injuries mid-flight, little Cher successfully managed to make it back to base and to relay this message to the Allies, who of course immediately ceased all artillery fire in the area. And again, I don't want you to think that this division was just biding their time. They were just, dug in, just holding out until they were rescued. Like, they were absolutely fighting for their lives, giving the Germans hell. Like, if they weren't fighting back, the Germans would have overrun this position days ago. But if the Germans tried to approach to launch grenades into them, they had a good chance of getting shot themselves. If they tried to machine gun fire onto this position, they better have been ready to take some fire back themselves. And so the bravery and gall of these men in this terrible position can absolutely not be overstated. But during this whole time, after days of being out here, Whittlesey had lost around 50% of his original 650-man division, and only by aggressively and bravely fighting back against the Germans were they able to hold their ground. But they were also running out of food and water and supplies, and so decisions were then made from the base to have pilots drop supply crates down for the division, which, as you can imagine, flying planes this low over known German areas, over active machine guns, was really a last-ditch approach. Like, a lot of these pilots should absolutely be commended for what they did. But they were, in the end, able to drop these supply crates. The only problem being that they dropped them in German areas. So they weren't quite able to make it to this particular spot. And in these attempts, multiple aircrafts were shot down by the Germans. And so after days of being under siege, of being starving and thirsty, some of these men, a group of 9, desperately, without authorization from the major, they went out to try and secure this supply package. And of these 9 men, 5 of them were killed almost immediately. It seems like they were ambushed by German machine gun fire, and the remaining 4 were injured at various levels of severity, with one particular soldier, one Private Lowell Hollingshead, being captured and being taken prisoner. And he was taken prisoner by a man named Heinrich Fritz Prinz, who spoke great English, to Holly's surprise, as he had actually lived in America for very many years. But he basically deep down had no real hate in his heart for Americans. He had lived there after all for many years, and he knew that Germany was soon losing this war. It seemed to be inevitable in his eyes. And so, partly out of an act of mercy, partly to stop more deaths on both the German and the American side, he ended up offering an olive branch to Whittlesey and his men. He told Hollingshead, "I will allow you to go back to your men, your brothers in arms, but you must take this message with you, and it is to go directly to your major." So Hollingshead then agrees to this. He makes his way back to the division, and he hands Major Charles Whittlesey this message. And I was going to do this in a German accent, but maybe I shouldn't. Und maybe I should. Und the message read, "Hollingshead has been taken prisoner by us on October. He refused the German intelligence officer every answer to his questions and is quite an honorable fellow, doing honor to his fatherland in the strictest sense of the word. He has been charged against his will, believing in doing wrong to his country, in carrying forward this present letter to the officer in charge of the 2nd Battalion of the 77th Division, with the purpose to recommend this commander to surrender with his forces, as it would be quite useless to resist any more, in view of the present conditions. The suffering of your wounded men can be heard over here in the German lines, and we are appealing to your human sentiments. A white flag shown by one of your men will tell us that you agree to these conditions. Please treat the Hollingshead as an honorable man. He is quite a soldier. We envy you." And that was a lot of fun, but I will probably never do a German accent again. I don't even know what Germans sound like. And they then led Hollingshead back to the outskirts, which was nearby the rest of his men. They blindfolded him, they led him there, and then they gave him this letter, they gave him the white flag, and they sent him back to his men, ensuring that no Germans in the area fire upon him. And when Whittlesey read this message, he decided to not surrender, to not even reply to the message, but rather to keep on fighting. And so they did. They were eventually flanked and rescued by their advancing Allied soldiers and troops. And in the end, of the 650 men who went in behind enemy lines just a few days ago, only 194 of them survived without any major injuries. So it is a wild story that I would highly recommend watching a long documentary on if it sounds interesting to you, which I promise it is very interesting. And Hollingshead actually, after the war, made contact with this German lieutenant who captured him, and after being dubbed as an honorable man by this Heinrich Prince, the two men actually stayed in contact for quite a few years up until the start of World War II, while the head of this division, Major Whittlesey, was one of only 7 men awarded with the Medal of Honor, but was likely extremely traumatized by this event, and he even blamed himself for firstly getting into this situation and for not being able to save more of his men, which I think he was being pretty harsh on himself, honestly. A lot of the men there actually thanked him for their survival. He was doing just exactly what he had been instructed to do, what he had planned to do, but it was just that either side had failed on their mission, and so they weren't able to cover his flanks. And in retrospect, they actually did incredibly well at holding their position, as saving as many men as they did, and actually in the push by the Allies later on in order to save this division, that kind of gave the rest of the battalions more motivation, more oomph in order to push the Germans back, and this resulted in them actually capturing more ground. But as I said, he blamed himself quite badly for the deaths of his men, and so in just 1921, a few years after the war, he was on board a ship heading to Havana, and after having dinner one evening, he walked out onto the deck alone at night and was never seen again. They later found a written note within his room, which was addressed to his former executive officer, that simply read, "Take care of the boys for me." So an insane story and event filled with confusion, bravery, gall, brutality, death, desperation, suffering, and sorrow and woe, and also an incredibly brave pigeon. Cher ami. So we did just cover the story of this very brave pigeon, but just a few more little tidbits to add about Cher ami. The name itself obviously means basically dearest friend in French, which is very cute. And also he was one of 600 homing pigeons bred and raised in England and donated to the US Army in order to use as messenger pigeons. And when Whittlesey and his men were trapped in this very tricky spot, and Cher ami, his last messenger pigeon, was sent out to relay this call for help, Cher ami flew around 25 miles in under half an hour, which is just insane. And this was through constant machine gun fire, shrapnel explosions. As we mentioned, he got pierced through the breast. He was blinded in one eye. One of his legs was almost completely blown off. Like, it was literally just hanging on by a tendon. And that leg was actually the leg with the message on it. So if that had gone, the message probably would have just fallen off. And so when you think about it, Cher ami basically single-handedly saved the rest of these men. Like, at least 200 men owe their lives to this little pigeon. And after delivering this message, after sustaining all of these injuries, the army medics actually operated on him, saved his life, and replaced his leg with a wooden leg, with him returning to the United States shortly afterwards. He was seen as an avian hero. He received the Croix de Guerre, or Cross of War, from the French government, and sadly died just a few months after returning to America, with him eventually being stuffed and preserved and mounted to stand tall for all to see, and is currently available to go visit and to pay respects to in the Smithsonian Institution's National Museum of American History in Washington, D.C. Germany helped Lenin. So this is something that I absolutely did not know before researching this. But this all started when Germany helped Lenin travel back to Russia more or less undisturbed. And so for a bit of background on this, before World War I, Lenin, this absolute creep-looking weird guy, was basically causing trouble in Russia. And this was with his Bolshevik communist propaganda that he was putting out and spreading amongst the people in order to get them to dissent against the Tsar rule. And don't get me wrong, the Tsars were absolutely insane as well. You know, the common man at the time was generally living in poverty, made even worse, obviously, by the war, and many people were struggling to eat or to live, all while the Tsars ruled the country and had fine foods and riches beyond imagination. Like, it was genuinely a massive imbalance inequality. But Lenin was at the time a revolutionary who spread communist propaganda in Russia. And so before the war, the Russians basically punished him, or at least the government did. And this was all before the war, and he handed out leaflets, he rallied people up, he started various clubs, basically talking about the destabilizing and overthrowing of the Tsar rule, and then the taking over of the entire country, potentially with a global communist revolution / takeover, which they did eventually try. But because of all of this, in the early days, the Tsars basically arrested Lenin. They even ended up exiling him to Siberia on a few occasions, which is a hellish landscape to live in. And so in order to avoid all of this, you know, getting arrested business, he basically fled or self-exiled himself to Switzerland, which was a neutral country at the time. So he reckoned while he was there, he could kind of work and study and gain support from fellow socialists, all while being safe from the Tsars arresting or prosecuting him. And he was there for almost 7 years with a few breaks in between. And while in Switzerland, he did study communism and Bolshevism. He did a bunch of writing. He worked through a lot of these ideas, came up with plans, etc., and attended meetings, gatherings. He was basically just building up support for his movement. And so when World War I broke out after a few years, the Germans were getting a little annoyed having to fight this war on two fronts, and so they devised a plan. And that plan was to take Lenin, who was in Switzerland at the time, and to basically grant him access to travel straight across Germany and then deposit him into Russia. And this was all done kind of under the table, and at Lenin's request, they promised not to really have any direct meetings with him and not to talk about what he would do when he went back to Russia, and also to give him and allow him to travel in this completely blacked out, shielded and sealed train. And this was, Lenin said, because when he went back to Russia, he didn't want any rumors about him working with the Germans, which were essentially the enemy at the time, as that might affect his popularity and his rise to power in Russia. But obviously the Germans knew all about Lenin. They knew he was a communist and Bolshevist. They knew he wanted to overthrow the Tsars. They knew he had been arrested on multiple occasions for sowing dissent. And so they didn't need formal meetings. They didn't need a formal plan. Lenin benefited from this because he was being transported right to the Russian doorstep. And the Germans obviously benefited from the destabilization of Russia. And it was unusual because this particular request for travel was highly, highly unusual in Germany at the time. You know, they were at war specifically against Russia. And so for them to, out of their pocket, arrange this special train, this special transport for a Russian citizen to get back to Russia, like, they obviously had ulterior motives in doing this. But in the end, they did arrange this train. Lenin did end up going back to Russia, with even Churchill himself saying, and I quote, that Lenin was sent into Russia by the Germans in the same way you might send a vial containing a culture of typhoid or of cholera to be poured into the water supply of a great city, and it worked with amazing accuracy. And there is evidence for all of this, for the Germans coming up with this idea, for them confirming this and arranging the train, all with the aims of Russian destabilization. And after this, they further promoted Bolshevism by actually sending these underhand black market business deals, funneling payments through Sweden into the Bolsheviks in Russia in order to further fund them and to further destabilize the throne, which is just absolutely insane. And as Churchill said, it worked amazingly. Lenin obviously fueled and headed both the February and the October revolutions. And when he got into power, he signed a peace deal with Germany, basically ceding some land and ultimately ending the German-Russian war. And the bloody Germans were behind it all the time. They were behind the overthrow of the Tsars, really, even though they were insanely unpopular and it probably would have happened eventually. They were also behind the Bolshevik uprising, again, indirectly, and it most likely would have happened anyway, but they definitely fueled those flames. And behind the ultimate rise of Lenin and ultimately Stalin, and I just never knew any of this. That's nice. But if you are enjoying the video, please do leave a like and subscribe to help me with my goal of 100,000 subscribers. Also, hype the video, as apparently that's a thing now. And of course, do enjoy the rest of the video. Nurse Margaret Mall was a nurse, obviously, who was born and trained in Britain before World War I, and during World War I, she was basically famous for being incredibly understanding and, more importantly, quite neutral as a nurse. So she would care for, obviously, British and French and Allied troops, but she was also known for showing sympathy and mercy to basically any fallen soldiers, that is including the Germans. She would often nurse back to health any captured, injured Germans, treating them exactly the same as if they were her own sides. And to comfort them, she would sing to them, she would ask how they're doing, she would check up on them daily, and she would even act for them on several occasions, putting on like a little theatrical show sort of thing, in order obviously to lift their spirits, to cheer them up, no matter which side they were from. And all of this was even after her brother, who was fighting on the front lines, was killed by the Germans, and still she didn't lose her faith. It didn't break her spirit or stop what she was doing. She still went right on through and saved and cared for every single soldier that she could. In 2013, there was even this old battered briefcase, or rather suitcase, that was found, which contained a bunch of Margaret's old war memorabilia, including her diaries and various letters and autographs and photographs from some of the soldiers she saved, many of whom were German. The crucified soldier was something we're not entirely sure actually happened, and this first came about as reports in Britain that an Allied soldier had been in Germany crucified by the Germans and pinned up against this barn door using bayonets through his hands and his feet, and it was just a horrific depiction. So, as almost always happens, these rumors and myths and stories ended up growing, ended up evolving, and then it became not just one soldier who was crucified, but 2 of them, 3 of them, an entire group or division of them, and then it became just the Germans are just crucifying everyone. And these propaganda posters were produced and they were circulated, which I think all definitely helped, rally up the soldiers of like, this isn't just a war between Britain and Germany, but rather this is a war between good, on the Allied side, and absolute evil, absolute depravity on the German side, which was overall quite disingenuous, quite dishonest, and not true. Most of the Germans were just normal soldiers, often kids, a lot of them, who were fighting for their country the same as any British soldiers might have been doing, or French soldiers. It wasn't quite the war of ideology that World War II was, but this sort of rhetoric, this sort of propaganda and depiction did work to increase conscription numbers within Allied countries, even though, as I said, we're not sure how many, if any, were actually crucified. The mystery of Celtic wood is partly a mystery, partly not a mystery, which will make more sense in just a little bit. But this covered the 10th Battalion of the 1st Australian Division, who in and of themselves were a fearsome fighting force known especially in Britain as the Terrible 10th. Not terrible as in awful, but terrible as in causing terror in the enemies. And they were skilled, they were effective, efficient, brave, and around this particular time, they were tasked with the taking of the Celtic Wood, which was in Flanders in Belgium, which was, at the time, controlled by the Germans. The British had performed multiple raids over the past few days, without honestly much success, and so they thought, right, let's send in the terrible 10th and just get this over with. You know, they're like the A-team or something. So with British artillery raining down on the area, disorienting the Germans, the terrible 10th, which was 85 men, made their way into the Celtic Wood. And honestly, it didn't go too well. They initially made some good progress. They were fighting their way in as only the terrible 10th could do, but they soon found themselves counterattacked, hit with German machine gun fire and artillery, and their escape was also completely cut off. Lieutenant Frank Scott was the leader of this division, and he was shot and killed quite early on during the counterattack. And so this raid soon turned into a bloodbath, with many of the terrible 10th being killed in the initial stages of this raid. Soon after they had run out of bullets, run out of ammunition, they had to resort to hand-to-hand combat with knives, bayonets, even fists, and many were injured, killed, with one account noting how one of the sergeants, Sergeant William Cole, tried to fire a flare to, signal to the division that it was time to retreat, that their position was overwhelmed and they couldn't fight on. And I will let you listen to this quote from one of the privates who experienced this all. And this was written by Private Rhodes. William Cole was with me. It was in the early morning on the 8th of October. We made a daylight raid on Celtic Wood. Cole was a sergeant, and he was to give the signal when to return. I saw him put up a flare, and immediately afterwards I saw him shot and he fell dead. I was about 10 yards off him, and I think his body would probably be buried by the 32nd Battalion, which relieved us. But despite all of that, the mystery behind the raid of the Celtic Wood was that so many of the soldiers in this division were in the end just completely unaccounted for. After they made their way out, their leader, Frank Scott, had been killed, a bunch of the high-ranking officers had been killed, and of the 85 men who started the raid, only 14 would return alive and well. A few more of the men were later found in the wood, but as many as 37 men, almost half the division, were just completely unaccounted for and were never found. The Germans themselves had no record of this raid, and so we weren't able to see what happened on their end, whether these men were captured or killed by the Germans or taken as prisoner, for example. And while some theories say that they slipped into a back room, another dimension, or that they were abducted by aliens or something, I think really the most likely explanation is also the most gruesome one. And that was that during this war, during World War II, or rather during World War I, I'm getting a little bit ahead of myself, but during World War I, sometimes these battle sites were absolutely brutal. And the soldiers may very well have just sunk into the mud, or been lost in the overgrowth, or horrifically were just blown to bits with heavy artillery and mortar fire. So in my mind, it's not really a mystery, but it is still an absolutely brutal raid. And the outcome of this raid, was basically the loss of the majority of one of the most skilled, courageous, and terrifying groups of men in the entire First World War. Walt Disney's newspaper. So this is a very interesting one. But Walt Disney, the man behind all of these fantastic cartoons, these films, characters, Mickey Mouse, Donald Duck. Well, he started his life in the years before World War I, obviously, from between the ages of 9 and 15, when he used to deliver newspapers for his dad. And he would be up at sometimes 3 or 4 a.m., he would do a paper round before school and then go to school and then leave early to do his evening paper round. So he was working like an absolute tank all before he turned 16. And come World War I, when he was only 16 years of age, he tried to join the war, but he was rejected because you had to be legally 17 years old. So with the support of his mother, he actually faked his birth certificate or his identification. He made himself appear older, and so he was able to then join the army. So at 17, he flew over to France, and this was in December of 1918, with the war ending technically in November of that same year. So he basically arrived just after the war had ended, and he served 10 months in France working with the Red Cross, basically doing some post-war work, i.e. not in combat. But while he was over in France, he took inspiration obviously from the French towns, with some of his later films, Beauty and the Beast, Pinocchio, Sleeping Beauty, Cinderella, etc. All classic films made by Disney and based in Europe. And since he had been a cartoon for a few years now, working for his high school newspaper, he spent some of his time while he was out there making little sketches of the war, drawing things that he saw, making essentially cartoons. He had these little characters. He would come up with like jokes on the drawings, little dialogues back and forth, and he would sometimes send these to some of his friends back home. He would sometimes send them to his local newspaper, as well as to a few other newspapers around the country, and he would send them also back to his school newspaper. And honestly, when you look at a few of them, they are pretty interesting. But as I said, he spends roughly 10 months out there making friends, working, helping out the local area, moving things back and forth. And while he's there, he actually ends up befriending a young man by the name of Ray Kroc, who, if you don't recognize the name, interestingly enough, is one of the founders of McDonald's, which, he didn't found McDonald's. He technically purchased the chain from the McDonald's brothers, but his purchase of McDonald's, whether you like it or hate it, was basically the thing that made McDonald's so successful, being a nationwide and even worldwide burger restaurant. So then Walt Disney obviously came home from France. He loved his work as a cartoonist, and so he set his life goal on founding a cartoon studio, with his name obviously being Disney, and the rest is history. Corporal Jackie. Oh boy, I thought we had gone over all of the World War I animals, but apparently not. And this was a baboon named Jackie, who belonged to a man named Albert Marr. And when South Africa joined the Allies, Albert was drafted, and so was Jackie. Like, he was literally a baboon drafted officially into the army. He received a uniform fit for a monkey. He received rations. He received various orders. He was taught how to salute his superiors properly. And he also did work on the front line, serving on the Western Front for a good 4 years. And he was trained to kind of keep a lookout, especially at night when human eyesight just wouldn't cut it. Monkey eyesight proved invaluable. And he would often notify other soldiers of German movements around the dark. He also helped with general labor tasks, with moving things, and on occasion actually went over the top into no man's land with his fellow soldiers. But in 1918, he was wounded by shrapnel fire, which severely damaged his right paw and obliterated his right leg, which he had to get later amputated. But for all of this, he made it home in one piece, minus a leg, and was given the Medal of Valor and the Pretoria Citizens Service Medal, as well as being promoted officially to corporal with several stripes showing that he was wounded in battle, he served for 4 years, and he had exemplary soldierly behavior. Tier 6, Attack of the Dead Men, was a very dark, I would say, event, where there was this fortress, the Osowiec fortress in Poland, or in modern-day Poland, and the Russians were defending it from the Germans, and the Germans at this point in time had tried to siege this fortress many times, but to no avail. So they eventually made a plan to wait until the wind was just right, and then they would launch over gas grenades all over the fortress, basically gassing everyone out. And then they would launch artillery strikes at the fortress, and then eventually they would have soldiers go in and to kill anyone who might have been left over. And they thought at the time, this is absolutely going to work. Nobody would survive constant artillery fire, gassing them, everything. But how wrong they were. So they went along with their plan. They gassed the fortress, they smashed it with artillery, but when the German soldiers went in to take the objective themselves, they were met with a gruesome counterattack. Because although the gas killed hundreds of Russian defenders, the remaining Russians, around 100 of them, had planned under the command of Lieutenant Vladimir Karpovich. They had planned to wait it out, to hide from the Germans, and then suddenly get up, with many of them coughing out blood, eyes red from the gas from being bloodshot, bleeding from their nose, just absolutely bloodied and destroyed. They got up and launched a devastating counterattack on the unsuspecting Germans. And this did work. It completely caught them by surprise, and it forced the Germans to retreat and to run back despite having a large numbers advantage. And this was at least partly because from the Germans' perspective, they had killed all of these Russians, and yet here they were, seemingly having risen from the dead, bloodied, wounded, bleeding from the eyes and nose and mouth, like they were using some sort of black magic or something. And this ended up actually winning them the battle, or at least the short-term battle. They still held the fortress, but did have to give it up eventually just because the lines were changing. The Russian army couldn't really defend this area any longer. And so it was kind of pointless in the end, but they did absolutely do their job. They held the position, and it must have been an absolutely terrifying sight to encounter. Who killed John Parr? So John Parr was a 15-year-old boy who faked his age in order to get into this war, like so many kids did back in the day, and did eventually join the war, and he was shipped off to France. Now, I should specify that he didn't fake his age to get into this war, because he joined the army 2 years before World War I started. So he turns 15, there's no war going on, he joins the army by using a fake age, and then when the war comes around, just 2 years later, he is 17 years old, and he was part of the initial group, the British Expeditionary Force, that was sent over in France and then made their way up to Belgium in order to defend against the initial onslaught of the Germans. And he is said to be the first British soldier to have actually died in World War I, as shortly after they arrived in Belgium, he and another reconnaissance cyclist, which, yes, they did exist in World War I, just people on bikes who were basically the scouts of old, on horses, and they would ride out really far, see what was going on, ride back, deliver some intel. But they, as the story goes, were initially sent out. It was John Parr and another cyclist, and they had unknowingly, apparently, entered a German area, and John Parr was shot when the Germans spotted him. The other cyclist did manage to get away, to get back to base, but that is how the story goes. And there isn't really too much evidence for this, and we're not entirely certain on, whether this was a case of friendly fire or whether he was just lost and unaccounted for, perhaps dying at a later date, or whether he truly was the first person, at least the first British person, to die in World War I. And Very interestingly enough, the last soldier to die in World War One, or the last British soldier to die, also died in Belgium, around 2 to 3 miles away from where Pa was said to have died. And what's even stranger is that John's body and the body of the last man who died, Private George Edwin Ellison, were and still are buried directly opposite from one another, literally only a few feet from one another, in the Symphorium Military Cemetery near Mons in Belgium. And this was completely by accident. The fact that these two soldiers were the first and last to die in the war wasn't exactly known at the time. It was only figured out later. And the cemetery that buried all of these men, they didn't bury these men or arrange them in any particular order. It was just lay anyone down anywhere, and it actually happened to line up like this, with the first Brit to die for his country and the last Brit to die for his country in the same war, many years apart, were buried just a few feet away from one another. The Kinmel Park Mutiny was a mutiny that took place in Kimnel Park, and that is all you need to know. Next entry. The crew of the Zebrina refers to a ship that was... Well, okay, if you insist. This was an event that happened just after the war ended, and this is when troops from all over the world were slowly making their way back home to, their respective countries. But obviously, they couldn't just catch a flight or even a boat back home often. This had to be done all above board, through the military, and so since this took a little while, you had cases like this where a bunch of Canadian soldiers, around 15,000 in this particular camp, were brought back from the European continent. They were brought to a safe area in England, in Wales, and they were all being housed there in these barracks, waiting to be shipped back home to Canada. And it was, I would say, very slowly and inefficiently done. The war ended, they were shipped up to Wales, and then a week passed, 2 weeks passed, 3 weeks passed, a month passed, and then 2 months, and then 3 months, and all the while, these soldiers were living in these cramped conditions. They were living on half rations. Their pay was also reduced. They were freezing most of the time. It just really wasn't very fun. And so, as you do, after 4 months of being in these barracks in these conditions, around 1,000 of these soldiers mutinied and started a riot. They destroyed quarters, they attacked people, they knocked over food containers, and just caused general mayhem and destruction. And I don't think it was their intention to kill anyone, but still, however, 5 men ended up dying as a result of these riots, with at least 21 men being wounded. In the aftermath of this riot, 78 soldiers were arrested, with many of them standing trial and being convicted of either starting or participating in this riot, and of course of mutiny, and received sentences ranging from around 90 days to 10 years service. But after all was kind of done and settled, many of the soldiers ended up being shipped back to Canada within the month, raising the question, obviously, of were these riots effective, or was the timing of them being shipped back just a coincidence? The crew of the Zebrina refers to a ship that was found, the Zebrina, that was delivering fuel, specifically coal, and shipping it from here in Falmouth, England, to here in Saint-Brieuc in France. And after just 2 days at sea, it was instead found here, washed up ashore, with the entire crew, captain and all, being nowhere to be seen. And it was honestly a very strange disappearance. The ship itself didn't really seem to be that much damaged. It was still floating, obviously, the hull was still intact, there were no major fires or destruction found on it of any kind. And as I mentioned, she was only on her journey for around 2 days. It wasn't like the crew was stuck out in the open waters for like 2 weeks or something, and they had to eventually abandon her. Like, it was a relatively short trip, all things considered, in a relatively calm part of the sea, and they couldn't find any of the crew, no notes or letters left behind, no messages sent or signals, and no rafts taken away, just nothing. The ship's logs noted that they left the port in Falmouth, and there was no additional or later information after that. So as far as theories go, there aren't really too many, but one interesting one that I read was that this ship was ambushed by a German U-boat, basically a submarine with guns, and the theory goes that this U-boat fired missiles at this ship as it thought perhaps it was a military ship, but because of the shape of this particular ship, in that its hull was quite flat, so instead of coming down like that, it was a lot more shallow, it was a lot more flat, so perhaps these missiles just ended up going underneath it. So then the theory goes that after firing and missing these missiles, this U-boat surfaced, it pointed its guns at them, threatened to blow them up if they don't comply with the soldiers. And so the captain and his crew just ended up going along with them. So again, according to this theory, the men were all taken onto the U-boat. The Zimmermann was left in the open waters, ended up drifting along before washing up on shore, and either the men on the boat were killed in the U-boat, maybe they were just shot on the spot or something, or they were captured as prisoners of war in Germany and never ended up making it home, or for whatever reason, the U-boat itself ended up being destroyed. Maybe a British U-boat ended up firing missiles at it, and then it sunk down to the bottom of the ocean, carrying along with it the captain of the Zimmermann and all of his crew, which definitely is a valid theory, I think, as really there's not too much evidence one way or another. It is quite strange that these people would abandon their ship, and if they did abandon it willingly, it's like, where would they even go? The scuttling of the German fleet. So just at the end of the war, after the armistice or peace agreement was signed, it was part of the agreement that all of the German ships would, at the time, be sent up to the Orkney Islands in Scotland, and they would basically chill and stay there until all the details had been worked out, and eventually the Allies would claim these ships for themselves. And so at the time, Germany basically accepted this. They went along with it. They moved all of their fleet under the command of Rear Admiral Ludwig von Reuter, who was a high-ranking German admiral. And he, after being interned there with all of these ships, decided to basically sabotage them all, as he didn't want the Allies getting their grubby little hands on these lovely German ships. So he said, well, if we can't have them, then nobody will. And in secret, he coordinated this plan. And he waited for the perfect moment when the local British Navy was away for various exercises, and at the drop of a hat, at his signal, all of these ships started to open up the floodgates, started opening up the water cocks, which that's the actual name for them. They're like little taps that's supposed to let water into the ship, which is sometimes used to like cool down machinery, that sort of thing. But they opened them all up. They opened all the water stopper doors. They smashed pipes all over the place. And due to the swiftness of this plan and the secrecy with which it had been started and performed, the British were unable to see what was happening basically until it was too late. They came back from their exercises, they saw some of these boats kind of slowly sinking, and they were like, wait a minute, we didn't have sinking ships when we left. And so even though they did board some of the ships, they did force all of the Germans to basically submit and to stop what they were doing. This resulted in the eventual sinking of 52 German ships, all sunk within about 5 hours. And this included battleships, battle cruisers, light cruisers, making it the largest single-day loss of ships in naval history. And there were various other ships which were saved or that weren't attempted to be sunk because they were beached, meaning they were up on the sand. You can't really sink that anywhere. But as I said, the British boarded a bunch of these ships. They ended up killing 9 German soldiers and wounding a further 16. And after all that was basically the end of the case. Many of these soldiers were taken as prisoner, but most were eventually just sent back to Germany after the war. And the admiral was also taken as prisoner, and he was kept in England for a few years before also just being sent back to Germany. And from the German perspective, he was seen as quite honorable, quite patriotic, and this all meant that the Allies basically got a lot less ships in the divorce. The SMUB UB-85 Sea Monster. So the SMUB-85, super cool sounding name by the way, but this was a type of German U-boat, and it did have a crew of around 34 men. And on the 30th of April 1918, this U-boat was spotted by British Navy forces floating around on the surface near southwest Scotland. So as you do, you fire some depth charges at this U-boat, and these depth charges did miss, but this kind of scared the Germans. They quickly tried to submerge, but upon trying to submerge, this U-boat started to flood, and so they had to kind of sheepishly, come back up to the surface, almost sinking themselves, and they ended up surrendering to the British. Now, that's the officially proven story, but when they were asked, when the crew was asked why exactly the U-boat was just chilling on the surface, out in the open in Scotland, easily spotted by the Navy, they said that the night before this, they were attacked by a vicious sea creature. And they said that it was this strange beast with large eyes, a horned skull, this small, creepy head, and sharp, horrible teeth. And they said it attacked the U-boat underwater, forcing them to surface and then get to the deck and basically fire machine guns at this creature until it fled the scene, ran away like a complete coward. And so, because of this and the damage that this sea monster did, they said that they couldn't resubmerge and they were just left out there in the open for the British to find them. Or so they say, because it was thought that they could have just made this up for whatever reason. Like perhaps they had made a mistake and they were floating around and then they were captured, and then because they were scared of admitting this back to the Germans back home, they said, look, we were forced to surface. It wasn't really our choice. We were attacked by this massive, crazy sea creature. But either way, we don't really know. Bertha Trost. So she was an interesting individual in World War I, and she was born in Germany. She married, then she had a kid, and then she moved from Germany to London in 1895. And she was quite a well-to-do individual, known for dressing nicely and for running a beauty salon and an antiquarium, which is not the same thing as an aquarium. But strangely, she was also known for allowing some of her rich clients to run up various debts, and she wasn't really too fussed about them paying it back on time, if at all, but she would say don't worry, it's on the house, you don't need to pay me back for that, but you have to, in exchange, give me some juicy gossip. And so she did often forgive some debts. She also often exchanged those debts for information or meetings with famous people or connections, etc. And so when World War I started, Bertha knew that her son in Germany had joined the army, and she heard rumors that he may have been captured by the British and he may be being held somewhere. And so she used some of her influence in trying to figure out where he might be kept or any updates on him or the status of him, and this was via her standard method of forgiving debts of various women in order for them to maybe talk to their husbands who is high up in the army or something like that. And so, as you can imagine, this brought the attention of the British intelligence. Some German woman living in London trying to get information about the army and about the military, and so they looked into Bertha and they saw that although she had been here for around 20 years, she was never naturalized as an actual British citizen, and so was, from their perspective, a German citizen, a very wealthy one, who was doing all types of spy stuff, espionage stuff, trying to get information about armies and militaries, or at the very least, trying to get sensitive information about maybe it was rich, powerful people, maybe some politicians, or about who knows what else, and for why knows what else, for why. And this was seen as a big no-no from British intelligence, so they basically classified her as an undesirable and suspected German spy, and they never officially charged or convicted her, like what happened with Mata Hari, but they basically just confiscated all of her businesses, all of her shops, and shipped her back off to Germany. And that was it. The artist J.M. refers to a British artist, or at least this amateur artist who was likely stationed on the front lines, likely served in the Royal Regiment of Artillery, but we don't know exactly who he was. He wrote these 2 volumes of these sketches, which are honestly pretty good drawings. There's some pretty funny ones, some witty ones, some of them are quite insightful, and they are dedicated to his daughter Adele. But although we have these sketches, although we have the name apparently of his daughter, we still don't know who JM is, or what his initials refer to, or where he lived, or if he had any family, obviously outside of his daughter. But we do know he was very, very likely British, just because of the regiment that he served in, and the fact that a bunch of his drawings have like British humor, you know, certain references or cultural references that would have been popular only in Britain at the time. And we think it's very likely that he survived the war, as there were some sketches actually dated to 1920. But outside of that, we don't really know much else. German Corpse Factory is mainly a propaganda campaign started by Britain in World War I, and that was the rumor that Germany was basically taking corpses, both Allied and German corpses, and processing them in their own factories, doing stuff like crushing up their bones and burning the soldiers' skin and fat in order to use in like candles and for fuel, and also they were cooking and eating their own soldiers' flesh. So yeah, this, as you can imagine, seemed to be very brutal. It was an intense piece of propaganda with almost no evidence behind it, and it was obviously designed to dehumanize the Germans, turn them into monsters, turn them into evil creatures, and to gin up patriotism all across Britain and as well across the Allied countries, and to get young men mainly to sign up to the draft and to fight in this war. And it should go without saying there was no real evidence for these claims, and that very likely the Germans were just disposing of corpses like any other country. But that's propaganda. Mafia, which I'm sure is just a typo, but mafia with 2 F's is just the way that mafia was written in early Italian spellings, or even in Dutch ones. And so this entry very likely just refers to the mafia's influence during World War I, which was honestly quite massive. And at the start of the war, as you can imagine, people were impoverished, they were starving, poor, hungry, desperate, and the government and the army badly needed money, resources, food, bloody horses, donkeys, chickens, and this was obviously the Italian army. And so the mafia at the time sort of saw this as a opportunity that they could take advantage of, and they were constantly able to lend certain people money. They were able to buy animals or munitions or what have you off the black market and then sell it at really high prices to the army. And this continued throughout basically the entire war, with the mafia taking advantage of all the desperation and chaos that was the First World War, and they earned a ton of money through all of their black market dealings and intimidation. And so after the war, with the rise of Mussolini, he saw the mafia as a giant threat and thought we just absolutely can't have them in the country, so he started to crack down quite heavily on them. And this was through arresting them, torturing them, killing them, and eventually, in turn, this led to a lot of them fleeing the country, notably over to America, and led to the whole Irish-Italian mafia sort of wars and gangs that you often saw on the east side of America. The Lost Sandringhams is a tale from a campaign we already covered, the Gallipoli Campaign, in which the Allies had a plan to take over Gallipoli, or rather the Gallipoli Peninsula, which was a key part of the Ottoman Empire at the time. And if it succeeded, it would have been an absolutely huge win for the Allies, but sadly, it did not. But this entry refers specifically to the regiment, the 5th Battalion of Norfolk, who, from everyone's perspective at the time, charged straight into this wooded area near the Turkish lines and just completely vanished. Nobody from the Allied side heard them again. They didn't know what happened to them, if they had been killed or captured, or were still somehow out there, maybe on their own, maybe in hiding, with no way to contact the Allied forces. So at the time, it was quite a big mystery. But since then, over the years, there have been multiple bodies found, different uniforms and insignia, etc., with a bunch of them being found in this large grave, implying that they were very likely ambushed, attacked, overwhelmed, and sadly all died, with a few of their bodies being buried perhaps somewhere else, a few of them being obliterated with artillery, and more still being buried in this large grave. There were some theories about, alien abduction or divine influence. But as I've said in a few previous entries, I don't think you need to ascribe that sort of explanation for cases like this. I mean, World War I was absolutely brutal as it was, and stuff like this seemed to happen more often than not. Boomerang grenades, which I don't really think you'd want those things coming back at you. Kind of defeats the whole point of throwing a grenade at the enemy. But actually, this was a proposed weapon in World War I that was designed and championed by an Australian engineer named Garrett Russell. And it was based on a hunting boomerang, which aren't actually designed to fly back at you, which is reassuring, but they are used often as a form of hunting where you will throw the boomerang, it'll spin around really fast, go really far, and they were solid enough so that when they hit the creature, especially with a hit on the head, it ended up more often than not either stunning or killing them. And then you would obviously walk over, pick up your boomerang, pick up the animal that you had just killed. And so the idea was you throw a normal grenade, you can't really throw it that far, but with these boominades, you would have, in theory, been able to throw them really quite a far distance. So the idea was to build this boomerang-like grenade, to fill it with shrapnel and a fuse, etc., and to light the fuse, throw the grenade-orang, and watch it go boom in the distance. This would obviously far outrange the enemy grenades, which is a boon. At least that was the plan, because while they did make a few test versions of this boomerang, it could just be called a boomerang because it goes boom. But it was never brought into proper usage because it was deemed really just too hard to really use effectively. In order to throw it really, really well, you had to be quite handily trained, and I'm sure if you were a proper Aussie mate, shrimp on the barbie sort of fella, you could maybe hit a few of these boominades. But for the standard soldier, they were deemed as just way too much training required to throw them properly. More often than not, they would just really not go very far, or they would hit some allies or something. And so the standard ball grenade that you just throw like a cricket ball or a baseball, that was seen as much more intuitive of a grenade. And so the boominade never really saw any action in the war. The British opium cigarettes. So opium in Britain, often in the form of opium pills, cigarettes, or tinctures, was somewhat popular in the 1800s, but had slowly been outlawed starting with the 1868 Pharmacy Act, and more strongly with the 1908 Act, which basically said, look, you can't just buy this stuff willy-nilly. Like, if you really want some of these opium cigarettes or something, then it's got to be on prescription, by an actual medical doctor for an actual medical reason. And this was because opium, it was found, tended to make people kind of lazy, sleepy, addicted to it, and it wasn't really good for a fighting force like Britain, especially not for the front lines. And during the war, with the Defense of the Realm Act, or DORA, who was also an explorer, this specifically banned the sale of devil's snow, shall we say, and of opium to military personnel. And they were still able to get these substances here and there through like black market sort of means. You know, if you wanted to have a dodgy cigarette or two here or there, but it certainly wasn't legal and it wasn't widespread. Because, as I said, it was detrimental to the soldiers' discipline, to their energy levels, and to their overall performance. So wait, what's that? Damaging to energy levels, performance, and discipline of a soldier, you say? Well, this sounds like a bloody good time for some psychological warfare. And so, in 1917, British General Edmund Allenby decided to give the order to airdrop thousands of these opium cigarettes over Turkish positions in Palestine, specifically where the Turks were known to look for tobacco, to kind of search and rummage and forage for it. And the idea was that these troops would find these cigarettes, they would end up smoking them, becoming addicted, becoming lethargic and lazy and undisciplined, and it would basically ruin the Turkish workforce and give the Brits the leg up in the war, which is one hell of a plan. And I do generally love quirky war tactics like this, and the outcome for this particular one seems to be kind of a mixed bag. The British sources say yes, these crazy Turks just smoked it all up, and then we won the battle and it was happy days for everyone except the Turks. Whereas everyone else kind of says, you know, there's no real evidence for any of this. Like, yes, there is evidence that these cigarettes were dropped, but whether the Turks actually smoked them, whether it had any effect on them as a fighting force. And so it's probably likely a minor part of why they won the battle, but not as big as the British made it out to be. And that is the strange story of the British opium cigarettes. The permanent Russian sentry. So this, I think, from what I can tell, is very likely just mere folklore, maybe rooted in some kernels of truth. But this was the story that circulated in World War I of a Russian sentry or guard inside of a fortress in Poland, who, after his fellow soldiers had either been killed or had left their post or had retreated back to the Russian lines, he was left alone in this fortress and refused to back down even after the war ended. And so some versions of the story have this sentry, this guard, as like being blind, typically from like his living conditions and battle wounds. And so he just patrolled this fortress, refused to back down, refused to leave it even after Poland was given sovereignty, and he was approached by Polish soldiers. Eventually, these soldiers did convince him, however, and after being at his post in this fortress for around 10 years, the war was over, the Russian Empire no longer existed, and he was finally free to, in some versions of the story, go back home to Russia, or in other versions to stay in Poland and live out his life there. And as I said, there's no real evidence for this, so it seems very likely to be, you know, some sort of rumor, some folklore of this hyper-disciplined, obsessed, patriotic Russian refusing to stand down no matter what. And while that sounds crazy and maybe impossible, it did remind me of this true, proven case of this Japanese soldier who went by the name Hiro Onoda, who was, during the war, sent off to Lubang Island in the Philippines, and he was instructed by his commander to stay on this island and just basically cause mayhem. It was a guerrilla warfare sort of role where he was told to shoot people who came nearby him, to hold down certain forested areas, to randomly explode little places, and to steal things all over the place. Just as I said, basically cause mayhem. And he did this for 29 years after the war ended. He was originally sent to this island with 3 other men, and when the war ended, these men basically didn't believe that it had actually ended. They thought that this was all lies and propaganda in order to get them to give up their position, and so it wasn't until 1950 that one of these men surrendered, and in 1954 one of them ended up dying, with the very last one dying in 1972, meaning that at this point in time Onoda was all alone, just holding out this area, living on his own on this island. I mean, he wasn't on his own, because there were many other Filipinos living on the island. But in terms of the men that he came here with, he was all alone. He was living off berries and fruits and animals that he had hunted and rice that he had stole from some of the locals. And so, a full 29 years after the war had officially ended, during this entire time, they were dropping flyers over him saying, the war's over, yay, peace. But again, he didn't believe any of it. They also then sent him some letters written by some of his loved ones, and he thought it was all propaganda, it was all lies. He was a good soldier, he wasn't going to give up his position, and he kept this up for over 29 years. And it wasn't until his former commanding officer, the one he served under during World War I, a man named Major Yoshimi Taniguchi, he came out, he flew to the island, and he told him in person that it was okay, that the war was over, and that he was relieved from his post. And so he finally accepted that the war was over. He went home, became a best-selling author, and then eventually moved to Japan, became a cattle rancher, and died in 2014 at the age of 91. So just one hell of a man. He was very likely, I think, kind of traumatized by this war and stuck to his orders given to him during the war. And during his time here of almost 30 years, him and his men actually killed several civilians, in some reports as many as 30, with their official rifles, as they thought this was part of this guerrilla warfare. But when he surrendered, he was pardoned by the Filipino president because he said that, in his opinion, he believed that this man genuinely believed the war wasn't over. And so in his mind, all of these killings by Onoda were simply just killings during a war, and he didn't really mean any ill will by them. So yeah, a pretty strange case. It does go to show you how something like the permanent Russian century might very well be possible. But as I said, there is no clear evidence for that particular case. Tier 8, the stab in the back myth, is the myth or paranoia that Germany didn't lose World War I because of normal reasons, because they had an inferior military or inferior tactics, or they were outnumbered or outskilled or what have you. But this narrative says that they would have won the war if not for those meddling kids. And by meddling kids, they of course mean Germans within Germany, betraying also Germany. So basically the theory is that it was an inside job. And this was, I think, founded on the idea and belief that Germany hadn't really lost World War I, and they were holding up their side on the Western Front. They hadn't been pushed back into their own country, and that this whole peace deal, the armistice, the German surrender, was basically brokered and arranged way too early, before Germany had like a real fighting chance in the war, and it was done by people inside Germany who wanted Germany to fall. And this theory typically blames like socialist politicians within Germany and communists, and of course Jews, which I'm not saying you should blame Jews. I'm saying at this time in Europe, especially Germany, as we saw with World War II, Jews were often the scapegoat for things like this. And so, as you can imagine, with Germany losing the war yet never being invaded, which was an important part of the mission during World War II, like even though Germany had lost the war, the Allies still decided to fully march with their armies into Berlin and take over the capital city, because they hadn't done this in World War I. Germany still kind of had its borders, and then they just agreed to a defeat. And so for a lot of the people living within Germany, they didn't see any enemy soldiers or enemy forces, and so it helped them buy into this idea of Germany never really lost. But during World War II, when you have all of these Russians and British and Americans coming into Berlin, it's hard to argue that Germany didn't lose. And so yeah, with them not seeing the defeat, with a lot of them believing that they could have gone on fighting, potentially even winning the war, and with them being unhappy that this surrender was made, and with all the blame on the communists and the Jews, you can kind of see how this very obviously would have led to World War II. And it's kind of insane looking back in retrospect at events like this. Like, it seems obvious to me that World War II would have sparked from something like this, from the lack of wealth all over Europe and Russia, from the rise of larger-than-life charismatic leaders like Lenin, like Mussolini, and obviously like Hitler in Germany, who typically came up to these broken countries, promised them food, promised them success, promised that their countries would be strong and they would invade other nations, win the wars. And I think a lot of these leaders were very obviously taking advantage of the desperation of these poor, starving, hungry people. The Hound of Mom is a tale. Whether true or not, I will leave that up for you to decide. But it tells of 5 men, including a captain, who went out to patrol no man's land one night and simply never returned. Their bodies were found a few days later, but instead of being blown up by shrapnel or riddled with bullets, their necks were instead ripped apart by some sort of vicious creature. And so this sparked the rumors of a massive, deadly hound roaming around no man's land and killing Allied soldiers. And soon a lot of the Allied soldiers started to hear these howls out in no man's land, especially at night. They would report seeing like a large grey wolf-like creature just walking around quietly, and still they were finding more and more bodies that had seemingly been attacked and killed in the same manner, that being large tooth marks, claw marks all over the body. And so obviously rumors started about this big horrible hound, with one account, this one story, suggesting that a German scientist by the name of Dr. Gottlieb Hockmuller was commissioned by the German government to create a war machine. And so he did that by surgically implanting the brain of this violently insane man into the body of a Siberian wolfhound, and then just simply letting it loose onto the battlefield to attack and kill whoever he may. And I don't think that's exactly how biology works, and I definitely don't think we had the technology then to do bloody brain transplants between species. But either way, that was the tale of the Hound of Mons. Prince the dog. So I thought we were done with heroic dog or animal figures in World War I, but apparently not. And Prince the dog may just be the most insane one that we've covered yet. And he was a half Irish Terrier, half Collie, who was owned by Private James Brown in County Cork, Ireland before the war started. And he joined up to the British Army at the start of the war and went off to France, as his wife also left Cork, but instead went to live with Prince the dog in London. And so at the time you have James in France fighting on the front lines, and his wife and little Prince the dog over in London. And then all of a sudden Prince just disappears. His wife can't find Prince. It's all sad, it's quite terrible. His wife is panicked and distraught and wondering what she's gonna tell James when he gets home. You know, little Prince has run away, he might be dead somewhere. He's just gonna have an absolute meltdown. But within around a month, Prince the dog would actually show up on the front lines in France. And it was found that he had run away from home, likely headed down south following soldiers, and then these soldiers inadvertently led him to a boat. And it was thought that the dog was able to recognize how the soldier dressed. He thought it looked familiar to how his owner had once dressed just before he was shipped off into France. And so he followed these people, he followed them onto this boat and went actually over into France. And then when he was on the front lines, word got around of this dog of this particular breed that had come into France. And so soon enough, Private James Brown and Prince were indeed reunited, which is just insane. And when he arrived, he didn't laze about, he got straight to work. He started to kill rats in the trenches, reportedly killing up to 137 rats in a single day. And he did the general dog stuff, barking at enemy movements or artillery whistling or gas or what have you. And he ended up returning to England in 1919 after serving on the front lines for 5 years. And he lived with his family there for sadly only 2 years before he died from exhaustion chasing a mouse, which, if there's any way for Prince to go out, that surely has got to be it. California's war on squirrels. So, as you can imagine, during the war, food was very much an important resource. And so what do you do if you have a little critter, say, something perhaps like a ground squirrel, who is typically known for eating up all of your precious food? Well, of course, you declare war on it. And this is what the governor at the time, Governor William Stevens, did. And in the last week of April in 1918, he declared it Squirrel Week, saying to all citizens, especially school kids, which is a weird thing to get school kids to do, but he basically said to them, if you see a squirrel, that was what he said. And so there were posters put up all over the place. There were leaflets handed out like it was a school fair or something. There were rewards set up for like which schools killed the most squirrels. And at the end of the week, over 104,000 squirrel tails had been submitted as proof of all of these killings, meaning that there were at least that many dead, perhaps even being upwards of like 200,000 killed. And this all didn't just stop at Squirrel Week. It basically carried on throughout the entire rest of the year, with thousands more squirrels facing their fate at the hands of these organized gangs of school children, armed with air rifles and slingshots and squirrel traps, and even poisonous gas, which, I mean, if it's life or death, if it's us or the squirrels, then yes, of course, I'm gonna go with humans. But this seemed like an insane campaign. And they're just so cute. Look at the little squirrel. But this story doesn't just end there, because there was also propaganda released depicting squirrels as the enemy, like literally. They depicted them as German soldiers wearing these German military uniforms, even including like the little spiked helmets and iron crosses. And so yeah, this is just an insane part of history that actually, in reality, probably saved the lives of thousands of people, whether it was men on the front line or citizens and civilians back home, just due to how much food they actually saved. But yeah, that is the Squirrel War. The wild men of no man's land. So we will end this iceberg with a bit of a strange entry, perhaps rooted in fact or reality or myth and legend, and as always I will let you decide that for yourself. But this was the tale of the wild men of no man's land, which were these strange, dark figures who were seen running around between the two enemy lines, or rather between the two trench lines. You had the Germans on one side, the Allies on the other, and then this whole space in between was apparently where these wild men lived. And there were reports, of course, of these strange screams in the middle of the night and of gunshots coming from no man's land. And also, as I said, these strange figures that seemed to be walking around in the dark. And then when they were approached, when they were investigated, they just disappeared. They were fugazi, fairy dust. And this led to rumors, obviously, of these strange groups of men living in no man's land between the two trench lines. And they were rumored to be either injured men who couldn't make their way back to their Allied side, or deserters who had fled their side, and so obviously couldn't go to the enemy side, couldn't go back to their side because they'd be killed, and so they had just decided to live out in no man's land, to maybe resort to cannibalism or to looting soldiers, picking up scraps, eating them. And yeah, it's a pretty brutal thing to imagine, I think. And it should be noted there wasn't really any evidence for this, at least in the documents in World War I. A lot of it tended to be rumors and myths and stuff that kind of spread and grew among the trenches. So definitely let me know what you think on this one down below. And that is all we have time for. And that was all the Germans had time for. The Allied powers, as you know, soon closed in on Germany and forced them to surrender. And 20 years later, the Germans are fed up of being poor and weak. And that's when a well-spoken man with some horrible, crazy ideas starts to surface, and soon he comes to power. He starts building up the military, then invades Poland in 1939, and that soon kicked off the next Great World War, which we will cover in full in the next video. And as always, thanks for watching.